Before we begin, if you find yourself wandering these peculiar tales of history and dark whimsy, consider subscribing to Uniteful Notions, where boredom and the macabre shake hands at the witching hour. Tonight's story, like all the others, is best enjoyed under the weight of heavy eyelids, though whether it lulls you to sleep or pricks your curiosity awake is a gamble we're both taking. Chapter 1. The Lure of the Gallows. Public executions were, for a very long time, the theater of the people. Not the kind with velvet curtains and overpriced wine, but the kind where the stage was a scaffold, the actors were the condemned and the hangman, and climax was a drop, a jerk, and a silence that settled over the crowd like a held breath finally released. It was entertainment, yes, but also something far stranger, a ritual, a warning, a communal act of morbid fascination that bound people together in the way only shared dread can. Take, for instance, the execution of one Edmund Blankley in 1782, a man whose crimes were so forgettable that history barely bothered to record them. What history did record, however, was the spectacle. The town square was packed hours before dawn, with vendors selling meat pies and gingerbread, children perched on shoulders, and fine ladies holding perfumed handkerchiefs to their noses, not out of disgust, but because the smell of the unwashed masses was far worse than anything the gallows could produce. Blankley himself was a disappointment, a thin, trembling man who wept so violently he had to be carried to the noose. The crowd booed. They'd paid, not in coin, but in time and anticipation, for a show, and he was failing to deliver. This was the paradox of the public execution. It was supposed to be a lesson, a deterrent, a display of justice's iron fist. And yet, people didn't come to learn. They came to gawk, to cheer, to gasp. They came because the forbidden was irresistible, because death was a thing that happened behind closed doors, in bedchambers and sick rooms. And here it was being served up in the open air, like a carnival trick. The gallows were a magnet for the curious, the bored, the pious, and the bloodthirsty alike. And then there were the sleepers. Yes, the sleepers. Every crowd had them, those rare, baffling souls who could doze off mid-spectacle. Perhaps it was the monotony of the preacher's final prayer, or the drowsy warmth of the sun after a long wait, or simply the strange comfort of being one in a crowd, where anonymity granted permission to drift. There was a famous account of a man in Chester who snored so loudly during an execution that the hangman paused, mid-rope adjustment, to glare in his direction. The crowd, ever eager for a diversion, laughed. The condemned, a sheep thief named Hobson, laughed too, despite himself. It was, by all accounts, the most cheerful hanging Chester had ever seen. But sleeping through an execution was a dangerous game. For one, it was terribly rude. The condemned had earned their moment in the spotlight, and to nap through it was a slight against the gravity of the occasion. Worse, it was a risk to the sleeper's own reputation. To be known as someone who could sleep through a hanging was to invite suspicion. What kind of person was so unmoved by death? A criminal, perhaps, or a philosopher. Neither were particularly welcome company. And yet, the temptation was understandable. Executions were long, drawn-out affairs. There were speeches, prayers, last words, often rambling, and the inevitable delays, a loose rope, a fainting prisoner, a missing official. The sheer tedium could wear down even the most eager spectator. And so, against all odds, people slept. They leaned against barrels, slumped on benches, or even curled up in the straw at the edges of the square, as if the gallows were just another lullaby. But here's why you shouldn't. Sleeping through an execution meant missing the point entirely. Not the moral point, those were flimsy things, tacked on like afterthoughts, but the human one. The gasp of the crowd when the trapdoor fell. The way the body jerked, like a marionette with its strings cut. The eerie silence that followed, when even the birds seemed to pause. These were the moments that stuck, the ones that followed people home and into their dreams. To sleep through them was to cheat yourself of the very thing you'd come for, the reminder that you, unlike the figure on the scaffold, were still alive. And so, as the sun rose over Edmund Blankley's limp body, as the crowd dispersed, some somber, some already laughing, most just hungry, the few who had napped through the event stirred, blinking and disoriented. They looked up at the gallows, at the swaying shadow, and realized, with a dull pang, that they'd missed it. The one thing that couldn't be rewound, replayed, or recounted properly over a pint later. They'd slept through death. And that, perhaps, was the greatest waste of all. Chapter 2. A brief history of spectacle punishments. Long before the gallows became the star attraction of town squares, before crowds gathered to watch necks snap and bodies twitch, executions were already a form of theater. The ancients understood something fundamental about justice. It had to be seen to be believed, and so they made sure it was impossible to look away. The Romans, never ones for subtlety, were particularly adept at turning death into a performance. Crucifixion was their masterpiece, a slow, agonizing spectacle designed not just to kill, but to humiliate, to terrify, to remind every onlooker precisely who held the power. The condemned were paraded through the streets, flogged raw, and then nailed or tied to wooden beams along well-traveled roads, where travelers, merchants, and children on their way to school would pass by for days. Death could take hours, sometimes days, and the audience was encouraged to participate, shouting insults, throwing stones, or, if they were feeling merciful, offering vinegar-soaked sponges to ease the thirst of the dying. It was interactive entertainment at its most brutal. Then there were the Greeks, who preferred a touch of elegance in their executions. The amapatimbanismos, a method of tying criminals to a wooden plank and leaving them to rot under the sun, was a favorite in Athens. It was slow, it was public, and it had the added benefit of being philosophically satisfying. Death by exposure was a kind of poetic justice, a return to nature in the most literal sense. Philosophers could debate the ethics of it while strolling past the condemned, as if the dying man were merely an interesting thought experiment. But it wasn't just the classical world that understood the value of a good show. Medieval Europe took the concept and ran with it, refining executions into something almost artistic. In England, traitors were hanged, drawn, and quartered, a process so elaborate it required multiple stages and a skilled executioner to ensure the victim didn't die too quickly. The crowd would watch as the condemned was half strangled on the gallows, then cut down while still alive, disemboweled, and finally chopped into pieces. The various parts of the body would then be sent to different cities as a warning, like grisly postcards. France, never to be outdone, gave the world the breaking wheel. The victim would be tied to a large wooden wheel, and the executioner would methodically smash their limbs with an iron bar, working from the legs upward to prolong the agony. If the crowd was lucky, the executioner might pause between blows to let the condemned beg for mercy or curse the heavens, adding a little drama to the proceedings. The whole thing could take hours, and it wasn't uncommon for vendors to circulate selling snacks and drinks to the audience. A well-timed cheese break made the suffering more palatable. By the time the Renaissance rolled around, executions had become so ingrained in public life that they were practically holidays. In 16th century Nuremberg, execution days were announced in advance so people could plan their schedules around them. Families brought picnic baskets. Street performers set up stages nearby to capitalize on the crowds. The executioner, far from being a reviled figure, was a minor celebrity. Skilled ones were in high demand, and towns would compete to hire the best. A clean beheading was a point of civic pride. But perhaps no one perfected the art of the executioner spectacle quite like the British in the 18th century. Hangings at Tyburn in London drew crowds of tens of thousands, with people cramming into every available space, windows, rooftops, even trees, for a good view. The condemned were paraded through the streets in open carts, often stopping at taverns along the way for a final drink. Some prisoners played to the crowd, cracking jokes or singing bawdy songs, turning their own deaths into a kind of macabre stand-up routine. The audience loved a good performer. And then, inevitably, the mood shifted. By the 19th century, the spectacle of public execution began to lose its luster. The crowds were rowdier, drunker, less reverent. The authorities started to worry that the lesson was being lost, that instead of deterring crime, public hangings were inspiring it. Pickpockets worked the audience. Fistfights broke out over the best viewing spots. Children saw things no child should see. The last public hanging in England took place in 1868. But the condemned man, a Fenian bomber named Michael Barrett, was led out to a scaffold hidden behind prison walls. The crowd denied their show, grumbled, and dispersed. Justice had gone indoors, where it could be administered neatly, quietly, without the mess of an audience. But for centuries before that, public executions had been more than just punishments. They were morality plays, cautionary tales, and grim entertainment rolled into one. They were the original reality shows, where the stakes couldn't be higher and the finale was always the same. And in a strange way, they worked. Not because they scared people straight, but because they reminded everyone, in the most visceral way possible, that death was always watching, always waiting, and never, ever boring. So the next time you find yourself struggling to sleep, think of those crowds. Think of the ones who dozed off during a beheading, or the ones who brought sandwiches to a burning. There's a peculiar comfort in knowing that restlessness, boredom, and the human ability to ignore the unimaginable are nothing new. And if all else fails, remember, at least you're not on the stage. Chapter 3. The Fine Art of Napping Mid-Execution. Sleeping through an execution is, in theory, an impressive feat. It requires a certain level of detachment, an almost artistic indifference to the drama unfolding before you. One must possess either the nerves of a philosopher or the exhaustion of a peasant who has spent all night milking irritable goats. History, in its strange way, has preserved a handful of cases where spectators managed to doze off at the most inopportune moments. Moments when the air was thick with anticipation, when the crowd held its breath, when the condemned man was halfway through his final rambling speech about the injustice of it all, only for someone in the front row to begin snoring like a contented bull. Consider the case of Sir Reginald Pugh, a minor nobleman with a notorious ability to fall asleep anywhere. In 1632, during the execution of a particularly long-winded pirate in Portsmouth, Sir Reginald was observed tilting backward in his chair, mouth agape, as the pirate delivered a 20-minute monologue on the tyranny of naval law. The crowd, initially riveted by the pirate's flair for oration, soon became distracted by Sir Reginald's increasingly rhythmic snores. By the time the noose was finally tightened, half the audience was more invested in whether the nobleman would topple over than in the pirate's fate. The executioner, a professional with little patience for amateur theatrics, reportedly glared at Sir Reginald before pulling the lever. The drop was swift, the neck broke cleanly, and Sir Reginald woke with a start just in time to see the body swinging. He yawned, blinked, and remarked to no one in particular that it had been a passably decent hanging, before shuffling off in search of breakfast. But how does one achieve such a state of serene detachment? Let us explore the techniques, both practical and psychological, that might allow a spectator to drift off while the world around them dissolves into screams and final confessions. First, one must master the art of selective attention. The human mind is a curious thing, capable of tuning out even the most shocking stimuli if properly conditioned. A seasoned execution-goer might treat the event like a particularly grim lullaby. The droning voice of the priest reciting last rites, the creak of the gallows being tested, the murmurs of the crowd shifting in place, all of it blending together into a monotonous hum. The trick is to focus on the rhythm, not the meaning. Imagine the priest's prayers as a shepherd counting sheep. Picture the hangman's adjustments to the rope as a sort of macabre bedtime ritual, like tucking the condemned in for a very permanent nap. Environment, too, plays a crucial role. The ideal execution napper must arrive early to claim the best sleeping real estate. A wall to lean against is preferable, though tree roots and hay bales will do in a pinch. Some accounts speak of particularly resourceful spectators bringing small pillows concealed beneath their cloaks for added comfort. Others simply relied on their neighbor's shoulder, a risky move given that the neighbor might be a pickpocket or, worse, an overly emotional mourner prone to sudden bouts of sobbing. Timing is everything. The most opportune moment to drift off is usually after the condemned has been led to the scaffold, but before the actual drop. This is the lull in the proceedings, when the crowd's initial excitement has waned, and the officials are busy with last-minute preparations. The speeches have been made, the prayers recited, the tears shed. All that remains is the mechanical inevitability of death, a concept so predictable that it practically invites a quick doze. Of course, there are risks. The most obvious is missing the main event entirely, which rather defeats the purpose of attending in the first place. There is also the danger of waking up disoriented, as one poor soul did in 1741, only to find himself staring directly into the wide, lifeless eyes of a freshly hanged man, swaying inches from his face. He reportedly fainted, much to the amusement of the crowd, who now had a second spectacle to enjoy. Worse still is the possibility of sleep-talking, a hazard illustrated by the unfortunate case of a Dutch merchant who, in the middle of a particularly solemn execution in Amsterdam, mumbled loudly about pickled herring prices. The executioner, a man with little patience for distractions, paused mid-rope adjustment to ask if anyone else was bloody well hearing this. But perhaps the greatest challenge is social. To sleep through an execution is to commit a grave breach of etiquette. The condemned, after all, has earned their moment in the spotlight. The least you can do is stay awake for it. To do otherwise is to suggest that their life, their crimes, their final words are not worth your full attention. It is the ultimate insult, worse than jeering or throwing rotten fruit. At least those reactions acknowledge the event. A snore reduces it to background noise. And yet, for those determined to master this dubious skill, there is one final piece of advice. Embrace the absurdity. Public executions were, at their core, deeply strange affairs, simultaneously solemn and grotesque, sacred sacred and profane. In that context, is it really so odd to treat them as just another place to catch up on sleep? After all, the world has never lacked for horrors. Sometimes the most rational response is to close one's eyes and pretend, if only for a moment, that none of it is happening. So the next time you find yourself at the foot of the gallows, surrounded by eager spectators and the scent of impending mortality, remember, you have options. You could gasp along with the crowd. You could weep for the condemned. Or if you're feeling particularly daring, you could yawn, settle into your cloak, and let the rhythmic creak of the rope lull you into oblivion. Just don't be surprised if you wake up to disapproving glares, or worse, to the sight of the hangman offering you the noose next. After all, if you're that tired, you might as well be the one taking the long nap. Chapter 4. Why sleeping through it defeats the purpose. Public executions were never really about the condemned. Oh, certainly the poor wretch on the scaffold might disagree, what with all the imminent dying and such, but the truth was far more complicated. The spectacle existed for the living, for the gathered masses who needed to see justice done, who required the visceral proof that order was being maintained, that sin would be punished, that the fragile social contract could be enforced with a length of good hemp rope. To sleep through an execution was to miss the entire point of the exercise, like buying a ticket to the opera and spending the performance examining the upholstery. Consider for a moment the psychological machinery at work in the public square. The execution was a ritual, as carefully choreographed as any religious ceremony. There were roles to be played. The stoic condemned, the solemn officials, the raucous crowd serving as both witness and Greek chorus. Each participant had their part, and the performance only worked if everyone stayed in their lanes. The man who dozed off in the middle was like a wedding guest snoring through the vows, an affront to the gravity of the occasion. The authorities understood this implicitly. When King Henry VIII ordered the execution of Anne Boleyn in 1536, he didn't just want her dead. He wanted the event seared into the public consciousness. The carefully staged spectacle, the swordsman imported from France to ensure a clean strike, the scaffold erected high enough for all to see, the Queen's final speech of graceful submission, was designed to reinforce royal authority. Why? A spectator who slept through it might as well have been thumbing his nose at the crown itself. There was also the matter of moral instruction. The crowds who gathered to watch hangings weren't merely bloodthirsty, though many certainly were. They were there to learn. Parents brought children to see the consequences of crime, the tangible endpoint of a life led astray. The execution sermon, a staple of the proceedings, often stretched for hours, with preachers hammering home the lesson that sin led inevitably to the gallows. A sleeping father, slumped against a post while the minister detailed the wages of wickedness, was failing in his paternal duty. His children might remember the snoring, but they'd miss the moral. The social contract aspect was perhaps the most fascinating. By gathering to witness an execution, the community reaffirmed its shared values. The act of watching, of seeing justice done, bound people together in a collective experience. The German sociologist Norbert Elias once described these events as civilizing rituals, moments when society's boundaries were made visible. The sleeping spectator, in this context, became a kind of heretic, rejecting the communal experience in favor of private oblivion. Then there were the practical considerations. Executions functioned as deterrents precisely because they were witnessed. The theory went that the memory of a man kicking at the end of a rope would stay with a potential criminal, giving him pause before picking a pocket or poaching a deer. This logic persisted well into the 19th century, despite mounting evidence that public hangings did little to actually curb crime. The sleeping spectator undermined this entire system. A man who could nap through a hanging was clearly not being properly deterred. The psychological impact on the condemned themselves shouldn't be overlooked. Facing death before a sea of faces was terrible enough, but imagine the added indignity of seeing someone yawn during your final moments. Records from Newgate Prison describe one highwayman who, upon noticing a gentleman snoozing in the front row, stopped his gallows speech to complain about the lack of respect. The crowd, ever eager for unexpected drama, cheered this interruption, and the sleepy spectator became the target of general mockery. The highwayman went to his death somewhat mollified, having at least won this small victory. Sleepers also risked missing crucial social cues. Execution crowds were mercurial, capable of turning from solemn to riotous on a dime. A man who dozed through the shift in atmosphere might wake to find himself caught in a surge of bodies rushing the scaffold for souvenirs, or worse, caught up in one of the frequent riots that followed botched execution. There were cases of sleeping spectators being trampled, pickpocketed, or even mistaken for corpses in the general chaos. Perhaps most importantly, sleeping through an execution robbed the spectator of the transformative experience. However gruesome, these events were meant to change those who witnessed them. The English diarist Samuel Pepys wrote vividly about attending the execution of Major General Harrison in 1660, describing how the sight of the regicide being drawn and quartered left him shaken for days. This was the intended effect, a visceral reminder of mortality and justice that would linger in the mind. The sleeper experienced none of this. He might as well have stayed home. By the early 19th century, reformers began arguing that public executions weren't just brutal, but ineffective precisely because of spectators like these. The sleeping masses, the drunken revelers, the distracted merchants, they proved that the spectacle had lost its power. If people could treat the ultimate punishment as background noise, then perhaps it was time to move justice indoors, where it could be administered with proper solemnity. In the end, the sleeping spectator represented something deeply unsettling to the authorities. Not just indifference, but a quiet form of resistance. To sleep through an execution was to reject its power, to declare oneself unmoved by the state's most dramatic display of authority. It was in its way a revolutionary act, albeit one performed by people who mostly just wanted a nap. So the next time you're tempted to close your eyes during life's more unpleasant spectacles, remember, society depends on your attention. The machinery of justice needs witnesses, not sleepers. The social order requires that you watch, that you remember, that you feel something, even if that something is just a desperate wish to be anywhere else. Chapter 5. The unfortunate case of the snoring spectator. History remembers most execution spectators as either bloodthirsty revelers or pious mourners, but tucked between these extremes lies a forgotten third category, those who treated the gallows as the world's most macabre nap spot. While most attendees came for the grisly spectacle, a select few seemed determined to treat public executions as the Elizabethan equivalent of white noise machines, dozing through dramatic final speeches, the creak of the gallows, and even the fatal drop itself. The sleepy spectators often became unintended comic relief, transforming solemn occasions into absurd theater, where the real drama wasn't the execution, but the audience's inability to stay awake for it. The most infamous case occurred in 1721, London, during the hanging of notorious thief Jack Sheppard. After 4 dramatic prison escapes that had captivated the city, Sheppard's execution drew record crowds to Tyburn. But as the rogue delivered his famously eloquent final speech, all attention shifted to a portly merchant in the front row, whose thunderous snores nearly drowned out the condemned man's words. Sheppard, never one to be upstaged, paused mid-sentence to remark, "I do believe that gentleman finds my life story less interesting than I do." The crowd erupted in laughter, while the offending sleeper, one Bartholomew Crump, woke in confusion to find several thousand people staring at him. Contemporary accounts suggest Crump became more infamous than Sheppard that day, with ballads circulating for weeks about the man who slept through Jack. Court records from Rouen reveal an even more embarrassing incident in 1583. A local magistrate named Pierre Lefebvre had sentenced a pig to execution for the murder of an infant, a common practice in medieval animal trials. The elderly judge, known for napping during proceedings, dozed off while the condemned pig was being led to the scaffold. Upon awakening to the squeals of the dying animal, the confused magistrate allegedly cried, "Bring in the next case," believing himself still in court. The incident inspired a local saying, "Sleeping like Lefebvre at the gallows," meaning to be oblivious to important events. Some sleepers achieved legendary status. In 19th century Edinburgh, a university student named Alistair MacGregor attended so many executions, purely for anthropological interest he claimed, that he developed an uncanny ability to time his naps perfectly. MacGregor would doze during the dull legal formalities, wake for the dramatic climax, then fall back asleep during the post-execution sermons. His classmates began taking bets on his precision, and rumors spread that he could sense impending deaths like a human barometer. The university eventually banned these wagers after MacGregor slept through 3 hangings in a row, leading to concerns that students were drugging him for amusement. Particularly embarrassing were cases where the sleeper was somehow connected to the condemned. In 1694, Marseille, the wife of executed smuggler Jacques Merle, caused a scandal by snoring loudly through her husband's final moments. When shaken awake by outraged neighbors, the unrepentant widow reportedly yawned and said, "If I had to listen to Jacques talk every night for 20 years, you'll forgive me for not finding his last words riveting." The local priest included the incident in his sermon the following Sunday as proof of modern moral decay. The phenomenon wasn't limited to Europe. Japanese woodblock prints from the Edo period depict similar scenes, including one famous image titled "The Sleeping Ronin at the Kozukapara Execution Grounds." The artwork shows a samurai slumped against a tree. As prisoners are led to the killing stakes, his loud snoring represented by artistic swirls in the air. Accompanying text explains this was based on a real incident where the swordsman, having drunk too much sake the night before, slept through 13 crucifixions and only woke when a fly landed on his nose. Medical journals of the period reveal physicians debating whether this peculiar ability to sleep through executions indicated robust health or mental deficiency. Dr. Erasmus Pettigrew's 1789 treatise on morbid sleep during public spectacles proposed 3 categories of execution sleepers: the naturally indolent, those constitutionally prone to napping, those constitutionally humorous. Pettigrew's case studies included a man who could only stay awake for hangings if he brought smelling salts, and another who developed the opposite condition, becoming violently ill if he stayed awake through an execution, but sleeping through them perfectly comfortably. The problem became significant enough that some executioners took measures against it. A 17th-century German executioner's manual included advice for dealing with disruptive sleepers, recommending assistants pour cold water on them if their snoring interrupted proceedings. In Sweden, execution grounds sometimes featured special alertness wardens, whose sole duty was to patrol the crowd and poke dozing spectators with long sticks. The most extreme solution came from a Scottish magistrate who ordered chronic execution sleepers to spend a night in the gibbet irons as punishment, creating the ironic situation of spectators sleeping through their own public humiliation. Perhaps the most bizarre recorded case comes from colonial Boston, where in 1712 a man named Jeremiah Whitcomb slept through his own brother's hanging. Whitcomb, who had argued bitterly with his sibling for years, arrived drunk to the execution and passed out before the noose was tied. When later questioned about missing this pivotal family moment, Whitcomb allegedly shrugged and said, "I've seen Isaac disappoint me sober many times. Why should death improve his performance?" The remark became so notorious that Puritan ministers cited it for decades as evidence of moral decay in the colonies. These stories reveal an uncomfortable truth about human nature. Our capacity for indifference is boundless. No matter how dramatic the spectacle, someone will always find it boring enough to sleep through. The execution sleepers of history serve as accidental philosophers, proving through their untimely naps that even death's drama has limits when competing with human exhaustion. Their stories survived not because of the executions they missed, but because there's something perversely comforting about knowing that in any era, no matter how grim, people remained reliably, wonderfully human, even if that humanity manifested as snoring through someone's final moments. As public executions faded into history, so too did the peculiar art of sleeping through them. Modern audiences, deprived of legal killing as entertainment, must find other occasions for inappropriate napping, shareholder meetings, academic lectures, family weddings. But somewhere in the collective unconscious, the spirit of Bartholomew Crump and his ilk lives on, ready to doze off at the least appropriate moment, reminding us all that no spectacle, no matter how gripping, is immune to the universal human need for a quick nap. Chapter 6. Execution Etiquette. Do's and Don'ts. Attending a public execution in centuries past required more social grace than one might assume. While modern minds might imagine these events as lawless free-for-alls where anything short of storming the scaffold was permitted, the truth was far more nuanced. A complex web of unwritten rules governed execution decorum, and violating them could earn one everything from dirty looks to actual legal consequences. Nothing, however, was quite so scandalous as committing the ultimate faux pas, falling asleep during the proceeding. First and foremost, one had to dress appropriately. While executions attracted all classes, from fishwives to aristocrats, Everyone understood this was a solemn occasion requiring proper attire. The working classes might don their Sunday best, while gentlemen were expected to wear dark, subdued colors, black being ideal, though deep brown or navy would suffice in a pinch. Bright colors were considered vulgar, as if one were treating the event as a carnival rather than an act of justice. A London haberdasher's advertisement from 1742 helpfully reminded customers that their new line of Gallows grey waistcoats were equally suitable for executions and funerals, being dyed with a special process to conceal blood spatter. Our arrival time was crucial. Coming too early marked one as overeager, while arriving late risked missing the main event and facing the derision of the crowd. The ideal spectator arrived with just enough time to secure a decent viewing spot, perhaps purchase a snack from one of the vendors circulating through the crowd, and exchange a few pleasantries with nearby attendees, but not so early that one grew bored enough to doze off before the prisoner even appeared. Punctuality showed respect for both the condemned and the justice system, while excessive enthusiasm suggested questionable morals. The matter of refreshments was particularly fraught. While eating during an execution was perfectly acceptable, indeed, many vendors made their living selling meat pies and gingerbread to spectators, certain foods were considered inappropriate. Crunchy apples or crispy bread might make too much noise during the solemn moments. Strong-smelling cheeses could overpower the more natural aromas of the occasion. And anything requiring complex cutlery was right out. No one wanted to be that person clinking a knife against a plate during the condemned man's final prayer. The ideal execution fare was something handheld, quiet to consume, and unlikely to stain one's clothing should the proceedings become unexpectedly messy. Conversation during the event required careful navigation. Before the condemned appeared, lively discussion of the crime and punishment was expected. This was, after all, part of the social experience. But once the prisoner mounted the scaffold, voices should lower to respectful murmurs. Commentary on the condemned's appearance was acceptable. He's aged terribly since the trial. But jokes at their expense were considered poor form unless one was very close to the gallows where the prisoner couldn't hear. The truly sophisticated might offer insightful observations about the execution method itself. This new Austrian drop mechanism is so much more efficient than our English short drop, demonstrating both worldliness and proper respect for the technical aspects of judicial killing. Children presented special challenges. While bringing young ones to executions was common, considered educational, like a particularly grim field trip, parents were expected to keep them under control. Allowing offspring to play games or make noise during the solemn moments reflected poorly on one's parenting. However, a child who asked thoughtful questions, "Father, why does the rope twist like that?" might be praised for their intellectual curiosity. The worst offense was letting a child fall asleep, as this suggested either neglect or that the parent had failed to properly impress upon them the gravity of the occasion. Now we come to the most egregious breach of execution etiquette: sleeping. To understand why this was so scandalous, one must appreciate the execution as a form of theater with three distinct acts. Act 1. The procession and mounting of the scaffold, where the main characters were introduced. Act 2. The speeches and prayers, where the moral lessons were delivered. Act 3. The execution itself, the dramatic climax. Sleeping through any of these was like walking out during Hamlet's soliloquy, an insult to the performers and fellow audience members alike. The reasons sleeping was so taboo were manifold. First, it showed disrespect to the condemned, who was, after all, the star of the show. However heinous their crimes, they deserved an attentive audience for their final performance. Second, it undermined the deterrent effect. How could executions prevent crime if people couldn't be bothered to watch? Third, and perhaps most importantly, it made the sleeper look suspect. Only someone with an exceptionally guilty conscience, or exceptionally bad manners, could sleep through such excitement. Should one find oneself growing drowsy, perhaps from the previous night's revelries or the monotonous drone of the prison chaplain, there were approved methods to maintain alertness. Subtle pinching of one's own thigh was acceptable, as was quietly shifting weight from foot to foot. Some execution regulars swore by keeping a sharp stone in their shoe to press a toe against when attention wavered. The truly prepared might bring smelling salts or a small vial of vinegar to sniff discreetly. What one absolutely could not do was lean against a nearby post, close one's eyes just for a moment, or, heaven forbid, begin snoring. The consequences for execution sleeping varied by era and location. In medieval times, a chronic offender might find themselves poked awake by the executioner's assistant with the same pole used to pull on dangling victims' legs. Puritan communities sometimes sentenced sleepy spectators to sit in the stocks wearing signs proclaiming their indifference. French aristocrats developed a more subtle punishment. The offender would find themselves excluded from the best viewing areas at future executions, forced to watch from inferior angles where trees or officials obstructed the view. Particularly egregious cases sometimes became legal matters. 1672 Parisian court case involved a man suing his neighbor for damages after the neighbor's loud snoring during an execution caused him to miss the crucial moment and therefore lose a substantial wager about how many times the condemned would twitch. The judge, while sympathetic, ultimately ruled that attending executions for gambling purposes was its own form of moral failing, and dismissed the case with a stern warning to both parties. For those seeking to recover from an unfortunate sleeping incident, the path to redemption was steep but not impossible. A sincere apology to any disturbed neighbors was a good first step. Some particularly penitent sleepers took to attending multiple executions in quick succession to demonstrate their renewed commitment to proper spectating. The most extreme case came from a Dutch merchant who, after sleeping through his business partner's hanging and thus missing the man's final revelation about hidden company funds, attended every execution in Amsterdam for 3 years straight, standing conspicuously awake in the front row as a form of public atonement. Modern readers might wonder why such elaborate rules developed around watching people die. But this misses the point. Executions weren't really about death. They were about community, about shared experience, about reinforcing social bonds through collective witness. The etiquette existed because the event mattered. To sleep through it wasn't just rude, it was a rejection of one's civic duty. So the next time you find yourself at a public execution, whether in the past via time travel or in some dystopian future where they've made a comeback, remember these guidelines. Dress appropriately. Arrive on time. Choose your snacks wisely. And whatever you do, stay awake. Your reputation, your social standing, and possibly your very freedom may depend on it. After all, you wouldn't want to become the next object lesson in why proper execution etiquette matters. That would be awkward for everyone involved. Chapter 7. The Science of Morbid Fascination. The human attraction to public executions reveals an uncomfortable truth about our species. We are, at our core, rubberneckers of the highest order. There exists in every beating chest a primal urge to slow down when passing a carriage wreck, to crane our necks at the sound of a scream, to peek between our fingers at things that should horrify us. This impulse is as old as civilization itself, as evidenced by the fact that ancient Romans left graffiti complaining about the Circus Maximus running out of criminals to feed to lions. The psychology behind this morbid curiosity is equal parts fascinating and disturbing, a perfect cocktail of evolutionary advantage and social conditioning that explains why thousands would happily pack a town square to watch a stranger die, but recoil at the thought of eating soup with the wrong spoon. At its most basic level, our fascination with death stems from survival instinct. Early humans who paid attention to violent ends, whether of prey animals or fellow tribe members, gained valuable information about threats to avoid. The ones who wandered off during saber-toothed tiger attacks didn't live long enough to pass on their inattentive genes. This evolutionary hangover manifests today as our inability to look away from car crashes crime scenes, or particularly gruesome historical reenactments. Public execution simply formalized this urge, giving it a scheduled time and place, complete with vendors selling roasted nuts for optimal viewing comfort. The social psychology is equally compelling. Anthropologists note that collective witnessing of punishment reinforces group bonds through shared experience. When an entire village watches a thief lose his hand, they're not just observing justice. They're participating in a ritual that defines their community's boundaries. This explains why execution crowds often displayed such uniform reactions, gasping in unison at the drop or cheering as one when the axe fell. The phenomenon persists today in diluted form. Consider how modern audiences synchronize their reactions to horror movie jump scares, or how sports fans collectively groan at a bad call. We've simply replaced the gallows with stadium seating, and the executioner with referees, though some might argue the difference is negligible. Cognitive dissonance plays its part as well. Most execution attendees considered themselves decent, God-fearing people who would never commit the crimes they came to see punished. Watching someone die for those crimes allowed them to resolve the tension between their self-image and their bloodlust through mental gymnastics. I'm not here because I enjoy death, they could tell themselves. I'm here to witness justice. This convenient fiction enabled Victorian gentlewomen to bring picnic lunches to hangings while still maintaining their reputations as delicate flowers of morality. The same psychological trick lets modern true crime enthusiasts binge murder documentaries, while considering themselves perfectly normal, upstanding citizens. The entertainment factor shouldn't be underestimated. Before Netflix and podcasts, public executions ranked among the most reliable forms of mass entertainment, combining elements of reality television, theater, and sporting events. The condemned was both star player and villain, the crowd both audience and participants. Like modern fans debating plot twists, execution spectators analyzed every aspect of the performance: the prisoner's demeanor, the executioner's skill, the quality of the final speech. Records show passionate arguments breaking out in taverns afterward about whether a particular hanging was well done or botched, with all the seriousness of modern film critics dissecting a director's latest work. Neuroscience offers its own insights through what researchers call the morbid curiosity window. The brief period when disgust is outweighed by fascination. Brain scans show that when presented with disturbing images, our amygdala screams "look away," while our anterior cingulate cortex whispers, but maybe just a little longer. This internal tug-of-war explains why people cover their eyes during horror movies only to peek through their fingers, or why respectable citizens who would faint at the sight of a kitchen accident would happily watch a surgeon perform a public dissection. Public executions hit the sweet spot between terror and intrigue, giving spectators the thrill of danger without any actual risk, unless one counted the ever-present threat of pickpockets working the crowd. The role of catharsis cannot be overlooked. Greek tragedy understood that watching terrible things happen to other people purges our own negative emotions. Public executions served this purpose for entire communities, allowing them to expel collective anxieties through the ritualized death of a scapegoat. After a good hanging, citizens reportedly felt more neighborly, more pious, more content with their lot in life, at least until the next market day when fresh grievances arose. Modern equivalents might include watching courtroom dramas or reading about celebrity downfalls, though these provide decidedly weaker purgative effects than seeing an actual head roll. Interestingly, class differences in morbid fascination reveal much about social dynamics. While all levels of society attended executions, their reasons varied dramatically. The lower classes often went for straightforward entertainment value, the medieval equivalent of something to do on a slow Tuesday. The middle classes framed it as moral education, bringing children to learn life's hard lessons. The aristocracy frequently attended as connoisseurs, judging the technical merits of the execution like wine critics assessing a vintage. Records show noblemen placing bets on how many heartbeats would follow a beheading, or whether a particular hangman could kill a man with precisely 3 drops of the rope. This stratification persists today in how different economic groups consume true crime content, from sensational tabloids to highbrow investigative podcasts. The religious dimension added yet another layer. Many spectators genuinely believed witnessing executions benefited their immortal souls, either as warnings against sin or as opportunities to pray for the condemned's salvation. Church leaders encouraged this view, though their motivations may have been as much about crowd control as spirituality. The particularly devout could purchase execution souvenirs like ropes or wood chips from the scaffold as sacred relics, the medieval version of buying a concert t-shirt to prove you were there. That these macabre keepsakes often became family heirlooms suggests our ancestors had very different ideas about appropriate household decor. Modern attempts to explain away our ancestors' love of public executions often rely on the comforting notion that we are more civilized now. But the numbers tell a different story. The last public hanging in America drew over 20,000 spectators in 1936. Today's most popular true crime podcasts regularly pull in millions of listeners per episode. Streaming services report huge viewership for documentaries about serial killers. We haven't lost our taste for the macabre. We've simply outsourced the messiness. Why attend a grisly execution when you can enjoy sanitized reenactments from the comfort of your sofa, pausing for snack breaks whenever the gore becomes too intense? Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of morbid curiosity is its universality. Every culture in every era has developed its own version of death spectacles, from Aztec sacrificial temples to Tudor beheading grounds to modern murder trial broadcasts. The packaging changes, but the core appeal remains constant. Even as society condemns the barbarity of past public executions, we construct elaborate justifications for our own forms of death voyeurism, proving that human nature hasn't evolved nearly as much as we'd like to believe. So the next time you find yourself engrossed in a documentary about Victorian murderers, or clicking through crime scene photos just out of curiosity, remember, you're participating in a tradition as old as civilization itself. The only real difference between you and those execution spectators of old is that they had better snacks and didn't pretend they were watching for educational purposes. At least our ancestors were honest about their bloodlust. Chapter 8. Famous Last Words and Snores. The Gallows stage produced 2 types of final performances. The carefully rehearsed last words of the condemned, delivered with all the dramatic flair of Shakespearean actors, and the involuntary nocturnal noises of spectators who somehow found death too dull to stay awake for. History remembers the former with solemn reverence, while conveniently forgetting the latter, though in truth both deserve recognition as authentic human responses to mortality, one fighting against oblivion with eloquence, the other surrendering to it with a wheeze and a snort. The tradition of last words transformed executions into improvised theater. Some prisoners delivered flawless final monologues worthy of the London stage. When English highwayman James Dalton mounted the scaffold in 1730, he bowed to the crowd and declared, "Gentlemen, I go from a corruptible to an incorruptible crown, which no thief can steal," before tossing his hat into the audience with perfect dramatic timing. Scottish rebel James Graham, in 1746, reportedly told his executioner, "My neck is very short, so take care lest you strike the wrong man and shame your profession," forcing the embarrassed headsman to measure his blade twice before swinging. These men understood their final moments as performances, determined to exit life with style points intact. Other condemned souls aimed for humor. French thief Pierre Duval, facing the guillotine in 1793, allegedly told the priest, "Father, could you stand a bit to the left? You're blocking my sunlight." English murderer John Smith, in 1705, when asked if he had any last words, replied, "Yes, but they're all second-hand. I stole them from better men." Even children weren't immune to the gallows humor phenomenon. In 1722, a 12-year-old pickpocket told his weeping mother, "Cheer up, Mom. At least now you'll have one less mouth to feed," before the hangman silenced his giggles with a drop. The pious took the opportunity for final sermons. Puritan martyr Mary Dyer, hanged in Boston in 1660, spent her last breath warning spectators about religious intolerance. Pirate Captain William Fly in 1726 used his platform to condemn brutal ship captains, shouting, "Let this be a warning to all tyrants at sea," until the noose cut him off mid-sentence. These speakers treated the scaffold as a pulpit, determined to convert their deaths into moral instruction, despite the audience's preference for blood over redemption. Then there were the less eloquent exits. Many prisoners found their carefully prepared speeches evaporating in the moment, leaving only whimpers or stunned silence. The archives overflow with uninspired final utterances like, "Oh God," various, "I didn't do it," countless, and the particularly unimaginative "Ara." Universal. The executioner's ledger from Würzburg Castle records one man whose entire last words consisted of the rope. Smells like onions, leaving historians to wonder about backstory they'd never uncover. But for every memorable death speech, there existed an equally memorable spectator snore to undercut it. The contrast could be jarring, a prisoner delivering a moving soliloquy about the fleeting nature of life while somewhere in the third row, a shopkeeper emitted guttural sleeping noises like a rusty hinge. Official court artists often edited these disruptions from their sketches, but diarists proved more honest. Samuel Pepys recorded 1661. Execution where a man's loud snoring prompted the condemned to pause and ask, "Shall I wait until the gentleman finishes his nap?" The crowd's laughter reportedly woke the sleeper, who then had the audacity to complain about the noise disturbing his rest. Certain professions became notorious for execution napping. Lawyers ranked particularly high, perhaps numbed by years of tedious court procedures. Clergymen came second, likely exhausted from ministering to multiple condemned souls before dawn. The worst offenders were execution regulars, those strange souls who attended every hanging like gruesome groupies, who sometimes fell asleep through sheer familiarity with the ritual. One such character in 18th century London, a butcher named Ned Plum, reportedly slept through 17 consecutive hangings before the crowd took up a collection to buy him a stool so he might at least snore in comfort. The timing of spectator sleep often created unfortunate juxtapositions. Swedish records tell of a 1692 execution where the prisoner's emotional farewell to his children was interrupted by a judge's sonorous snoring from the official platform. The executioner, showing unusual sensitivity, actually delayed the drop until the young man could be pinched awake by his mortified father. In colonial Virginia, a slave's dignified silent march to the gallows was undercut when the plantation owner's wife began sawing logs so vigorously her bonnet vibrated off her head. Some sleepers became unintentional comic relief. A famous broadside ballad from 1733 immortalized the tale of Sleepy Sam, a tanner who dozed through a triple, hanging only to wake and applaud, thinking the swinging bodies were some new form of street performance. When informed of his error, Sam reportedly said, "Well, it was still better than most puppet shows," before wandering off to find breakfast. The ballad's refrain, "Sleep through the dying, miss all the crying," became a popular catchphrase for those wishing to appear worldly about death. Medical journals of the era debated why some people could sleep through such excitement, while others couldn't stomach even watching. Dr. Franz Metzger's 1778 treatise on morbid sleepwalking included a case study of a Leipzig baker who reliably fell asleep at every execution yet remained wide awake during church services. Metzger theorized the man associated public death with his childhood trauma of witnessing a mill accident. causing his mind to shut down defensively. Less charitable observers suggested the baker simply found executions boring compared to his flour calculations. The phenomenon crossed all social boundaries. King Louis XV's court physician recorded that the Duc de Chartres once snapped through an entire parricide execution at Versailles, only waking when the man's severed head struck the basket. The Duke's explanation, "I stayed up too late playing cards," was accepted without comment, proving aristocratic privilege extended even to gallows etiquette. At the other end of the spectrum, prison archives contain numerous complaints from guards disciplined for sleeping on duty during executions, their defense invariably being that the repetitive nature of the job wore down their alertness. Perhaps the strangest cases involved people who slept through their own family members' executions. A surviving letter from a Bristol merchant's wife apologizes to her sister for missing their brother's hanging, explaining she accidentally took too much laudanum for her nerves and slept through the event. Even more bizarre was the 1714 Paris case, where a man sued his cousin for failing to wake him for their uncle's beheading, thus depriving him of the chance to hear the old man's rumored deathbed confession about hidden family gold. The judge dismissed the case, but not before lecturing both parties on proper priorities when facing mortality. The competing sounds of last words and last snores created an auditory tapestry of human responses to death, some fighting it with rhetoric, others surrendering to unconsciousness, most simply waiting for the whole business to be over so they could get lunch. This strange duality persists today in diluted form, the solemn newscaster reporting tragedy while viewers doze on their sofas, the funeral attendees struggling to stay awake during eulogies, the student snoozing through a lecture on genocide. We've not changed so much as found quieter ways to express our contradictions. So the next time you hear some noble last words quoted in a documentary or engraved on a monument, remember there was likely an equal but opposite reaction happening just off stage. Some weary soul treating mortality as the universe's most effective sleeping pill. Both responses, in their way, remain profoundly human, one reaching for meaning in the face of oblivion, the other proving that even death can't always compete with exhaustion's pull. The gallows held space for philosophers and nappers alike, and history is poorer for pretending only the former mattered. Chapter 9. The Executioner's Perspective. The executioner stood at the center of the spectacle, yet remained curiously invisible. A hooded figure whose job required precision, but whose person demanded anonymity. While crowds focused on the condemned man's final moments, few considered the professional at the rope's end, least of all those spectators who treated the whole affair as background noise for their afternoon nap. To understand the peculiar offense of sleeping through an execution, one must first understand how the executioner viewed his craft, his audience, and those unfortunate souls who failed to give his work proper attention. A skilled executioner took pride in his profession. The good ones trained for years, apprenticing under masters to learn the exact drop needed for a clean break versus the short drop that produced slow strangulation. They knew how to position hands when strapping down a prisoner for the guillotine to prevent last-minute struggles, how to sharpen blades to ensure single-stroke beheadings, how to calculate weight ratios for hanging ropes. The French executioner Charles-Henri Sanson kept meticulous notes on each execution, recording details like wind speed and rope elasticity alongside the condemned's final words. To these professionals, an execution was a performance requiring perfect coordination between lead actor and stagehand, with death itself as the critic. This professional pride made spectator indifference particularly galling. Imagine spending hours preparing the scaffold, testing the mechanism, calming the prisoner, only to notice some overdressed merchant in the front row, dozing through your masterpiece. The English executioner Jack Ketch's 1686 journal contains a furious entry about a nobleman who slept through 3 consecutive hangings. His lordship's snores were so loud the prisoners complained they couldn't concentrate on dying properly. Ketch eventually took revenge by accidentally flicking blood onto the man's expensive waistcoat during a beheading, noting with satisfaction that the nobleman stayed wide awake for subsequent executions. Different executioners developed various methods for dealing with sleeping spectators. The German Meister Hans of Nuremberg employed a clever tactic. He'd pause dramatically before the fatal moment and announce, "We'll wait until the gentleman in blue finishes his dreams," inevitably causing the crowd to laugh and startle the offender awake. Spanish executioners sometimes sent assistants to adjust the seating of chronic sleepers, which invariably meant giving their bench a sharp kick. The Venetian Antonio della Scala took more creative measures, once arranging for a bucket of cold fish guts to be accidentally spilled on a notorious execution napper, telling authorities the smell was meant to revive fainting spectators rather than specifically target one rude patron. The executioner's sensitivity to audience engagement stemmed from practical concerns as much as wounded pride. A distracted crowd was more likely to miss cues and disrupt proceedings. French records describe a 1721 incident where a sleeping lawyer's sudden snort startled the executioner into releasing the guillotine blade prematurely, resulting in a botched beheading that required 3 extra chops. The executioner successfully sued the lawyer for compensation, arguing professional damages. After that, Parisian executioners reportedly began scanning crowds for sleepers before commencing, like conductors checking for inattentive orchestra members before raising their batons. Some executioners developed superstitions about sleeping spectators. The legendary London hangman William Marwood refused to proceed if he spotted anyone dozing, believing it brought bad luck. His successor James Barry held the opposite view, considering sleepers good omens since they were already halfway to death's door anyway. Scandinavian executioners often spat 3 times when noticing a sleeper, while their Russian counterparts made warding signs against the evil eye. The Prague executioner Jan Midlarz took the bizarre step of keeping tally marks for each sleeper he spotted, though whether this was professional curiosity or some private ritual remains unknown. The condemned prisoners themselves sometimes commented on sleeping spectators, usually with indignation. Scottish rebel leader William Wallace reportedly paused mid-speech in 1305 to glare at a snoring English knight, growling, "Am I boring you, my lord?" before continuing his defiant last word. In 1587, Mary Queen of Scots carefully stepped around a puddle of drool from a sleeping guard while mounting her execution platform, an act of fastidiousness that somehow made her final moments even more tragic. The highwayman Claude Duval supposedly altered his entire gallows speech after noticing a sleeping woman in the crowd, switching from solemn reflection to increasingly outrageous lies. "I once robbed Oliver Cromwell's ghost," until her shocked gasp upon waking satisfied his performer's pride. Executioners developed distinct classifications for spectator sleepers. There were the droopers, heads bobbing but occasionally stirring, the logs, completely motionless, and most offensive, the trumpeters whose snores disrupted proceedings. The Parisian Executioners Guild even had an official term, dormeurs de la mort, death sleepers, and kept records of particularly egregious cases. Their archives note one man who slept through 7 executions in 1702 before finally attending an 8th wide awake, only to faint during the beheading and crack his skull on the cobblestones, thus becoming a spectacle himself. The relationship between executioner and sleepy spectator reached its absurd peak with the case of Sir Geoffrey Wilcot, an English magistrate who notoriously napped through every execution he attended from 1711-1733. The hangman at Tyburn, frustrated by Wilcot's unbroken streak of inattention, finally resorted to extreme measures. When Wilcot began his customary snooze during a triple hanging in 1734, the executioner quietly instructed his assistants to carry the sleeping magistrate onto the scaffold after the bodies were cut down. Wilcot awoke to find himself strapped to the hanging tree, with a noose loosely around his neck, while the executioner politely asked if he'd like to experience the proceedings from a professional perspective. Historical accounts differ on whether Wilcott fainted, screamed, or voided his bowels. But all agree he never slept through another execution. As public executions declined in the 19th century, the executioner's frustration with distracted audiences transferred to the more private setting of prison yards. The English hangman William Calcraft complained in his memoirs about jurors and officials who treated executions as social obligations rather than solemn events, chatting about the weather while he adjusted the noose. The last public executioner in France, Louis Dibre, reportedly kept a flask of ammonia salts specifically to revive dozing officials during private guillotinings, lamenting that even when we make death convenient, nobody pays proper attention. Perhaps the final word belongs to an unnamed executioner whose 1804 diary was discovered in a Munich archive. In an entry describing yet another botched hanging due to spectator noise, he writes, "They come for the show but can't stay awake for the finale. The condemned at least know their lines. The crowd, they can't even manage to watch properly. If death is a play, then life is the nap they take through the best parts." It's as close to philosophy as his profession allowed, a weary acknowledgement that even the most dramatic exits can't compete with humanity's boundless capacity for indifference. So the next time you read some noble last words or admire a prisoner's stoic final march, spare a thought for the executioner, that much maligned professional trying to conduct his grim work while half his audience snores through the performance. In the theater of death, he was both stage manager and supporting actor, his craft diminished not by the cruelty of his work, but by the indifference of those who came to watch it. At least the condemned had the decency to pay attention. Chapter 10. When executions went private. The great vanishing act of the 19th century was not some magician's illusion, but the slow disappearance of death from public view. Across Europe and America, the scaffold that had anchored town squares for centuries retreated behind prison walls, taking its grim performances away from the cheering, jeering, and, most crucially, the snoring masses. This quiet revolution changed not just how society killed its criminals, but how it felt about watching. The public execution, that peculiar intersection of justice and entertainment, became first controversial, then unfashionable, and finally illegal, though not without resistance from citizens who complained they were being robbed of their traditional diversions. The reformers' arguments sounded noble enough. Public executions brutalized spectators rather than deterring crime, they claimed. The carnival atmosphere undermined the solemnity of justice. Children should not witness such violence. But beneath these high-minded concerns lurked a more pragmatic truth. The crowds had become too difficult to control. Pickpockets worked execution days with impunity. Drunken brawls broke out regularly. And perhaps most damningly, the audiences were no longer properly attentive. They chatted, they ate, they wandered about, and yes, they slept through the main event with increasing frequency. When death became commonplace, even the most dramatic exit could struggle to hold an audience's attention. England led the charge toward private executions with its 1868 Capital Punishment Amendment Act. The last public hanging at Newgate drew a modest crowd compared to the throngs of old. Just a few hundred die-hard enthusiasts rather than the tens of thousands who once flooded Tyburn. The newspapers noted the disappointing turnout with a mixture of relief and nostalgia. When the law changed, there were no riots in the streets, no petitions demanding the return of public hangings. The great British public simply shrugged and found other amusements, proving perhaps that the reformers had been right all along about the shallow nature of the spectacle's appeal. France followed suit more gradually. The guillotine, that great democratizer of death, had been specifically designed for public viewing with its elevated platform and dramatic silhouette. Yet by the 1890s, executions were moved to prison courtyards at dawn, with only officials and journalists present. The change came after several incidents where spectators threw rotten fruit at the executioner, or in one notorious case, launched into an impromptu rendition of La Marseillaise during a murderer's final moments. The authorities realized they could no longer trust the crowd to behave with appropriate decorum. When death became theater, the audience insisted on becoming part of the show. America's transition proved more uneven. While northeastern states embraced private executions early, some southern states continued public hangings well into the 20th century. The last occurred in 1936 in Owensboro, Kentucky, where Rainey Bethia's execution drew over 20,000 spectators, including families with picnic baskets and vendors selling souvenirs. The carnival atmosphere shocked the nation and sealed the fate of public executions for good. Newspapers particularly noted the presence of children and the drunk, rowdy behavior of many attendees. The spectacle had not ennobled or educated the crowd. It had merely entertained them, and rather poorly at that. The shift to private executions changed the psychology of capital punishment in subtle ways. Without an audience to play to, condemned men and women often abandoned the traditional gallows speeches and dramatic last stands. The final walk became shorter, the rituals more perfunctory. Executioners reported that prisoners facing private deaths tended to be more fearful and less defiant. Without a crowd to witness their courage, the performance seemed pointless. The journalist George Orwell, witnessing an execution in Burma, noted this phenomenon. It is curious how completely the absence of spectators changes the whole character of the event. Without an audience, it becomes merely a sordid secret killing. The executioners themselves faced an identity crisis. Once minor celebrities with recognizable hoods and nicknames, they now became anonymous civil servants. The French executioner Anatole Diable complained in his memoirs about the loneliness of private executions. No crowd to appreciate his technique, no gasps at his perfect aim. He missed the validation, though not the occasional rotten tomato. English hangmen found their pay reduced as executions became simpler, more clinical affairs without the need for crowd control or elaborate processions. The press struggled to adapt to the new regime. Newspapers that had once published detailed illustrations of hangings now had to content themselves with dry official statements. Some resorted to poetic euphemisms. The trap was sprung with alacrity or death was instantaneous, while others sent reporters to lurk outside prison walls, hoping for some dramatic final cry to justify their headlines. The Manchester Guardian ran a famous 1892 piece, lamenting the sterilization of death, in which the reporter strained to hear any sound from behind the prison walls, only to conclude, "Justice was done today, and all we know of it is the ringing of the bell that told us it was done." The public's relationship with state violence changed in unexpected ways. Without the visceral reality of public executions, capital punishment became more abstract, a political issue rather than a communal experience. Reform movements gained traction precisely because most citizens no longer saw what execution actually entailed. The tidy phrases of court judgments, "hang by the neck until dead," replaced the messy reality of twitching legs and creaking ropes. In this sanitized form, execution lost much of its emotional power, becoming just another government function rather than a collective ritual. Yet, the human fascination with death refused to disappear entirely. When executions went private, other spectacles rose to take their place. Murder trials became media sensations, with courtroom sketches satisfying the public's hunger for drama. True crime literature flourished. The same people who once attended hangings now devour accounts of Jack the Ripper or the exploits of frontier outlaws. The crowds that once gathered at Tyburn now lined up for Madame Tussauds' Chamber of Horrors, where waxen corpses provided safer thrills. Even the sleeping spectators found new venues for their naps. Same gentlemen who dozed through hangings now drifted off during lengthy murder trials or public lectures on phrenology. Children who might have watched executions now yawned through Sunday school lessons about hellfire. Humanity's capacity for indifference simply redirected itself toward other, less lethal entertainments. The final irony came when some jurisdictions began allowing limited audiences for executions. Journalists, officials, and sometimes victims' family members. These witnesses often displayed the same behaviors that had once scandalized the public square. Reporters doodled in notebooks during the final prayers. Officials checked their pocket watches. In one infamous 1923 case, a Texas prosecutor fell asleep during a hanging and had to be woken to confirm the prisoner was dead. The more things changed, it seemed, the more they stayed the same. Perhaps the most telling legacy of private executions was how quickly the public forgot them. Where town squares once held permanent scaffolds, now stood monuments and fountains. Children played where crowds had once gathered to watch men die. The stones that had absorbed so much blood now bore only weather stains. Within a generation or two, public executions became historical curiosities rather than living memories, the subject of nostalgic ballads and romanticized paintings rather than actual experience. And yet, in our modern world of sanitized violence and virtual spectacles, part of us still longs for that raw connection to mortality our ancestors knew so well. We binge murder documentaries and click on crime scene photos, seeking the thrill they found in the creak of the gallows. We replace the public square with the smartphone screen, the executioner with the algorithm, but the hunger remains. The last public execution may have faded into history, but the complex, uncomfortable fascination that drew crowds to them still lingers in our collective psyche, waiting, perhaps, for some new outlet our ancestors would have understood perfectly. Chapter 11. The Art of Subtle Disinterest. The truly sophisticated execution spectator never simply slept through proceedings. Rather, they perfected the delicate art of appearing profoundly engaged while mentally composing grocery lists or calculating how much longer they could stand before needing to relieve themselves. This performance of false attention became its own kind of high art, with practitioners developing techniques that would put modern students feigning interest in corporate meetings to shame. The history of public executions is, in many ways, also the history of elaborate social pretense, the endless human capacity to be physically present while psychologically elsewhere. Victorian ladies proved particularly adept at this double consciousness. Their arsenal of parasols, fans, and handkerchiefs provided perfect cover for moments of wandering attention. A well-timed flutter of lace could conceal a yawn, while angling a parasol just so allowed one to examine one's cuticles during the duller prayers. The 1874 Diary of Constance Pembroke contains detailed notes about adjusting her bonnet ribbons to create a sightline blockage when the hangman prepared his noose. This way I might contemplate the stitching while appearing to contemplate eternity. Her contemporary Arabella Whitcomb famously embroidered an entire handkerchief during a triple hanging in York, her needle moving in perfect rhythm with the executioner's preparations. When complimented on her composure, she allegedly replied, "The secret is to focus on the cross-stitch rather than the cross to which we all must cling." Gentlemen developed their own methods. The pocket watch inspection became a classic maneuver, ostensibly checking the time of death, actually calculating how soon one might escape for lunch. Some carried small notebooks to scribble in, creating the impression of recording profound thoughts about mortality when in fact drafting business correspondence or sketching caricatures of the prison chaplain. The industrialist Reginald Moore's private papers include dozens of execution notes that upon closer inspection proved to be factory production, tallies with occasional morbid doodles in the margins. His 1863 journal entry explains, "The trick is to sigh gravely while reviewing quarterly numbers. They'll assume you're moved by the prisoner's plight rather than annoyed by falling wool prices." The clergy faced special challenges, being expected to maintain unwavering attention during lengthy execution sermons. Bishop Alistair Crowthorne's 1829 Manual for Young Priests includes an entire chapter on maintaining an appearance of grave attention during tedious public deaths. His advice ranges from the practical, mentally reciting psalms to stay awake, to the philosophical, contemplating one's own mortality during dull moments makes the time pass productively. He particularly cautions against the nodding canon phenomenon, when a priest's slow, thoughtful nods of agreement with his own sermon accidentally transition into sleep bobs. The solution, he suggests, is to periodically pinch one's thigh under the robes, though he admits this becomes problematic during summer months when thinner vestments leave less to the imagination. Medical professionals attending executions developed their own brand of plausible detachment. Doctors were expected to observe the proceedings with clinical interest, which conveniently allowed them to zone out under the guise of scientific detachment. Dr. Ephraim Whitcomb's execution journals reveal an elaborate system of coded annotations where symbols like S, satisfactory drop, and U, unsatisfactory convulsions, masked his actual notes about dinner plans and household expenses. His 1842 entry on the hanging of murderer Thomas Wells begins with apparent medical observations before devolving into a shopping list that includes laudanum, fresh leeches, and that French mustard cook keeps complaining about. Even the condemned sometimes participated in this theater of disinterest. Professional criminals particularly cultivated an air of boredom toward their own executions, knowing this unnerved spectators, expecting tearful repentance. Highwayman Dick Turpin reportedly yawned dramatically while the hangman adjusted his noose, asking if they might hurry along as he had another engagement in hell. The burglar William Shepherd amused himself during his 1724 execution by counting sleeping spectators, announcing the tally to the crowd before his drop. This practice became something of a trend among London's criminal class, with prisoners competing to spot the most inattentive audience members, a final petty theft before meeting their maker. The working classes, lacking parasols and pocket watches, developed more creative methods. Market vendors perfected the art of appearing to watch while actually inventorying their wares. Laborers discovered that leaning forward with one hand propping the chin created an excellent napping position that from a distance resembled intense contemplation. Street urchins became adept at darting through crowds during executions, ostensibly seeking better views, actually picking pockets while everyone's attention was elsewhere. The journalist Henry Mayhew recorded one boy's explanation: "When the toffs looks up at the hanging man, they never looks down at their purses." Artists and writers attending executions faced unique pressures, being expected to produce profound observations about the human condition. Many developed coping mechanisms for when inspiration failed. The poet William Wordsworth allegedly composed grocery lists in his head during hangings, counting syllables to maintain iambic pentameter while deciding between tea varieties. Painter J.M.W. Turner would sketch the crowd rather than the scaffold when uninspired, his famous execution studies actually being detailed portraits of distracted spectators in various poses of feigned attention. Newspaper reporters perhaps reached the zenith of this art, required to take voluminous notes while remaining emotionally detached. The veteran crime reporter J. Kingston Pierce's notebooks reveal elaborate doodles of hanging mechanisms in the margins of otherwise straightforward reports, the geometric precision of his Gallows sketches suggesting a mind only partially engaged with the human tragedy unfolding before. His 1857 account of the Manning's execution famously includes a perfectly measured diagram of the scaffold's dimensions, immediately followed by the phrase, "Mrs. Manning died badly," as if the structural details held equal weight with the human drama. Children brought to executions as moral instruction often proved hilariously inept at subtle disinterest. Diaries and letters abound with complaints about fidgeting youths who asked inconvenient questions at solemn moments or became distracted by passing clouds. The clergyman John Allen's 1832 journal laments a particularly disastrous outing where the children in his charge began playing tag during a murderer's final prayer, forcing him to abandon the lesson in Christian mercy and instead bribe them with sweets to sit quietly. The rise of photography added new dimensions to this performance. As cameras became common at executions, spectators had to maintain their attentive facades for posterity. The famous 1879 photo of the Glasgow hangman's audience shows rows of perfectly solemn faces, until one notices the telltale glazed eyes and slightly slack jaws revealing minds elsewhere. Modern analysis has identified at least 3 spectators in that image subtly picking their noses, and 2 others apparently daydreaming about something decidedly non-mortal. Perhaps the most ironic twist came when prison officials began requiring staff to attend executions, whether they wanted to or not. Guard journals reveal elaborate strategies for enduring these mandatory events, from mentally planning gardens to silently reciting poetry. The 1891 diary of Warden's assistant Thomas Gregg includes detailed plans for a chicken coop sketch during 6 consecutive hangings, with notes like "broody hen needs separate nesting area," juxtaposed against clinical descriptions of prisoners' final moments. This enduring human capacity for selective attention says something profound about our relationship with mortality. We may arrange elaborate rituals around death, but our minds persistently wander toward the mundane, toward grocery lists and business concerns, and whether we left the stove on. The execution spectators who perfected the art of subtle disinterest weren't being callous so much as human. Their mental absenteeism a defense against the overwhelming reality before them. In our modern world of endless distractions, we've perfected these techniques beyond our ancestors' wildest dreams. We maintain eye contact in meetings while mentally composing emails. We nod along to conversations while scrolling through phones. The parasols and pocket watches have been replaced with smartphones and smartwatches, but the dance remains the same. The eternal human struggle to be present while constantly, inevitably, somewhere else. At least our ancestors had the decency to pretend. Chapter 12. The Nap That Sparked a Riot. The town square of Pressburg had seen its share of unusual executions, but never one where the condemned man had to compete with the drunken tanner's snores for the crowd's attention. The morning of April 7, 1743, began like any other hanging day. Vendors selling warm beer and meat pies, children perched on shoulders for better views, the usual mix of solemn piety and barely contained excitement vibrating through the gathered masses. No one could have predicted that by noon the gallows would be in flames, the executioner would be hiding in a butcher's shop, and the entire incident would be remembered forever as the snoozing tanner's riot. The protagonist of our tale, though he would strenuously object to this characterization, was one Joseph Koller, a leather worker of some local repute and prodigious capacity for cheap wine. Having celebrated his daughter's wedding until the small hours, Koller had stumbled to the execution half asleep, and considerably more drunk than was wise for a public event requiring basic decorum. He found a comfortable spot against a market stall, folded his arms, and promptly began sawing logs with the vigor of a man who considered sleep a competitive sport. The condemned man, a highwayman named Lucas the Fox, took the stage with his usual flair. Known for his dramatic speeches and habit of kissing ladies' hands on his way to the scaffold, Lucas had prepared what he considered his magnum opus, a 20-minute soliloquy about injustice and the corrupt nobility. He cleared his throat, waited for the crowd's murmurs to hush, and began his carefully rehearsed opening line. "When history judges this day," at which precise moment Koller unleashed a snore so thunderous it startled birds from the rooftops. The crowd tittered. Lucas frowned, but continued. "When history judges this day, it shall see not a criminal, but another snore, this time with a wet, gurgling quality that suggested troubling things about Koller's nasal passages. More laughter. Tee. A woman in the front row snorted into her handkerchief. By the 5th interruption, Lucas abandoned rhetoric and snapped, "Would someone wake that drunken bastard?" Thus began the chain of events that would culminate in what the Pressburg Gazette later called the most undignified execution in living memory. The executioner, a humorless man named Schmidt, gestured to his assistant to deal with the disruption. The assistant, a pimply youth named Franz, approached Koller cautiously. Accounts differ on whether he intended to shake the man awake or simply move him elsewhere, but what's certain is that in his nervousness, Franz knocked over a basket of rotten apples beside the sleeping tanner. One particularly mushy specimen hit Koller square in the forehead with a wet splat. Koller awoke swinging. His fist connected with Franz's nose in what eyewitnesses described as a perfect arc of drunken physics. The assistant reeled backward into a group of merchants' wives, who began beating him with their parasols under the mistaken impression he was making improper advances. Someone threw a cabbage. Someone else, possibly the cabbage vendor, responded with a flurry of turnips. Meanwhile, up on the scaffold, Lucas the Fox was rapidly losing control of his carefully planned exit. "Good people," he bellowed, trying to regain the crowd's attention. "If I might have your—" A flying sausage cut him off mid-sentence. The executioner Schmidt, sensing his moment slipping away, made the executive decision to proceed with the hanging despite the developing melee. What happened next became the subject of tavern arguments for decades. Schmidt pulled the lever. The trapdoor opened. Lucas dropped, but the rope, improperly secured in the chaos, snapped after barely a foot of descent. The highwayman landed on his feet with an undignified oomph, his now loose noose dangling around his neck like a scarf. The crowd, already primed for chaos, took this as some sort of divine sign. A woman shrieked that God had intervened. A student shouted that they should free Lucas. A butcher's apprentice began passing around a bottle of spirits in celebration. Meanwhile, Kola the tanner, now fully awake and convinced the entire town had turned against him, grabbed a wooden plank and began defending himself with the vigor of a sober man despite being 3 sheets to the wind. The scene devolved into what official records would later euphemistically term a multifaceted civil disturbance. The gallows caught fire when someone knocked over a brazier. The executioner fled when several spectators decided to test his blade's sharpness on his posterior. Lucas the Fox, ever the opportunist, slipped away in the confusion and was never seen in Pressburg again, though rumors persisted of a dashing robber in neighboring provinces who particularly targeted merchants who sold rotten fruit. By the time the town guard restored order, the square resembled the aftermath of a small war. Broken market stalls, trampled hats, and inexplicably 17 left shoes littered the cobblestones. Kola was found asleep again, this time in a horse trough, his snores finally uninterrupted. The mayor's proclamation the next morning banned both public drunkenness at executions and the sale of excessively soft produce at civic events. The trial that followed became its own kind of spectacle. Kolar, charged with inciting a riot, defended himself by claiming he'd been wrongly awakened and that any reasonable man would have punched whoever ruined his nap. Judge, after sentencing him to a week in stocks, reportedly muttered that it was the most honest testimony he'd heard in years. The executioner Schmidt left town shortly after, telling anyone who would listen that he was moving somewhere with more respectful audiences, eventually finding work in Vienna where the crowds were reportedly better behaved, if no more attentive. The Pressburg snoozing tanner's riot entered local legend, retold with increasing embellishment over the years. By the centennial celebration, the story had grown to include a romance between Lucas and the mayor's daughter, Koller single-handedly defeating the town guard, and the gallows transforming into a giant bird that flew away. The actual participants, had they been alive to hear these versions, might have protested, except Koller, who likely would have slept through the rattlings anyway. In the grand tapestry of execution history, the incident serves as a perfect metaphor for humanity's relationship with mortality. We build elaborate rituals around death, construct solemn ceremonies and profound meanings, and then some drunk snores through the whole affair, reminding us that even our most sacred moments can't compete with basic human needs like sleep and the overwhelming desire to punch whoever interrupts. The authorities in Pressburg learned this lesson the hard way. If you're going to kill a man in public, at least make sure the audience is properly caffeinated first. Chapter 13. Sleeping Through History. A Metaphor. Humanity's propensity for dozing through grim spectacles has never been limited to public executions. The sleeping spectators of the gallows were merely practicing an ancient art that stretches far beyond town squares and swinging ropes, the art of selective attention in the face of uncomfortable truths. History moves forward whether we watch or not, and those who choose to nap through its darker moments often wake to find the world changed in ways they never anticipated. The execution sleepers of old would feel right at home in our modern age of willful ignorance and distraction, proving that while technology evolves, human nature remains stubbornly consistent. Consider the courtiers of Versailles who perfected the art of napping through royal pronouncements, only to wake in 1789 to the sound of angry mobs and the smell of burning aristocracy. Or the Victorian factory owners who dozed through parliamentary debates about child labor laws, then acted shocked when legislation forced them to stop employing 8-year-olds in their mills. The parallels with modern executives scrolling through Twitter during climate change presentations are too obvious to ignore. Every era has its sleepers, its determined lookers away, its professional avoiders of inconvenient realities. The psychology behind historical sleepwalking reveals uncomfortable truths. Just as execution spectators developed elaborate justifications for their attendance, moral instruction, civic duty, family bonding, we construct equally flimsy rationalizations for our own inattention. The businessman who sleeps through his company's ethics training is no different from the medieval peasant who napped through executions out of sheer familiarity. Both are exercising that most human of privileges, the right to ignore what doesn't immediately threaten one's comfort. The 18th century pamphleteer who wrote, "Let them eat cake," might today tweet thoughts and prayers with the same detached sincerity. Religious institutions particularly mastered this duality. The same churches that hosted solemn execution sermons also produced priests who slept through them, their snores mixing with the amens. Modern megachurches preach charity, while parishioners check their phones during poverty appeals. The venue changes, the technology updates, but the fundamental disconnect remains. A 15th century cardinal turning a blind eye to corrupt indulgences, and a 21st century televangelist ignoring financial scandal are spiritual cousins, separated by centuries but united in their ability to compartmentalize. The aristocratic art of selective attention reached its zenith in the years before revolutions. French nobles playing cards while their servants starved, Russian Grand Dukes hunting while peasants burned, British landlords collecting rents from estates they'd never visited. These were the virtuosos of cultivated indifference. Their modern equivalents might not wear powdered wigs, but they share the same knack for maintaining blissful ignorance through careful social insulation. The gated community is just Versailles with better Wi-Fi and fewer wigs. Even the scientific community isn't immune. The Royal Society members who dozed through early smallpox inoculation debates would recognize their kindred spirits in modern anti-vaxxers ignoring mountains of evidence. The 19th century doctors who dismissed germ theory might today be blogging about miracle cures. Progress happens not because humans naturally incline toward truth, but because eventually reality becomes too loud to sleep through, though many certainly keep trying. The sleeping spectators at executions were engaging in what we now call normalization. The first hanging shocks, the 10th bores, the 100th becomes background noise. Modern audiences experience similar numbing through endless news cycles and viral tragedies. School shootings, political scandals, environmental disasters, each initially horrifying, then gradually fading into the white noise of daily life. Our ancestors had physical gallows in their town squares. We have metaphorical ones in our social media feeds, both equally easy to scroll past with practiced indifference. Art and literature have long chronicled this human tendency to sleepwalk through history. Shakespeare's watchmen who missed the crucial ghost, Dickens' aristocrats feasting while London starved, Kafka's bureaucrats pushing papers as nightmares unfold, all recognize humanity's gift for snoozing through alarms. The modern equivalent might be the commuter ignoring homeless encampments, or the suburbanite dismissing water shortages as someone else's problem. The set dressing changes, but the plot remains familiar. Perhaps most disturbingly, the sleepers often prosper. While activists exhaust themselves trying to wake the world, The determinedly indifferent continue collecting promotions and pensions. The execution spectators who slept through hangings likely lived more peacefully than those who watched intently, ignorance being not just bliss but frequently profitable. Modern studies confirm what our ancestors intuited. Those who pay least attention to societal problems often report the highest life satisfaction. The price of awareness has always been discomfort. The mechanisms of avoidance evolve with technology. Where our ancestors had literal sleeping, we have infinite scrolling. Where they had carefully angled parasols, we have curated news feeds. The gentleman who once studied his pocket watch to avoid seeing a beheading now studies his smartphone to avoid seeing inequality. The tools grow more sophisticated, but the impulse remains stubbornly primal. See no evil unless it directly threatens one's brunch plans. Yet history also shows that sleepers eventually get woken, often violently. The French Revolution, the Industrial Revolution, the civil rights movements, all served as alarm clocks for complacent societies. The trick, as always, is waking up in time to steer the change rather than being steamrolled by it. The execution spectators who adjusted to private hangings fared better than those who kept showing up at empty gallows, wondering where the show had gone. This presents the fundamental paradox. Society needs both sleepers and the awake. The sleepers provide stability through their indifference, while the awake push progress through their discomfort. Too many sleepers and civilization stagnates. Too many awake and it collapses from constant upheaval. The healthy society balances its spectators and its snorers, though never to either group's full satisfaction. In the end, the sleeping execution spectators may have been onto something. Their ability to treat profound moments as background noise speaks to a deep human wisdom about emotional conservation. The modern world, with its endless crises and bottomless news cycles, might benefit from such selective engagement. The trick is choosing when to pay attention and when to mentally check out, a skill our ancestors practiced at the gallows and we now practice at our screens. So the next time you feel guilty for tuning out some modern outrage, remember your execution watching forebears. They understood that no one can stay perpetually woke in the original sense of the word. Sometimes survival requires closing one's eyes, if only to preserve the energy needed to open them at the right moment. The true wisdom lies not in constant vigilance, but in knowing which executions demand your attention and which can be safely snoozed through. After all, history keeps executing its sentences whether we watch or not. The only choice is whether we want ringside seats or a good nap before dealing with the aftermath. Chapter 14. The Psychology of Avoidance. The human mind possesses an extraordinary capacity for not seeing what it would rather not see, for ignoring what it cannot bear to acknowledge, for dozing through even the most dramatic of life's performances. This psychological sleight of hand explains not only why certain spectators could sleep through public executions, but also how entire societies continue to ignore unfolding catastrophes with practiced ease. The mechanisms of avoidance are both intricate and universal, operating with equal efficiency whether one is ignoring a hanging in the town square or climate change reports on a smartphone screen. Consider first the matter of repetition. The first execution one witnesses tends to imprint itself indelibly upon the memory, the creak of the rope, the twitching limbs, the final gasp. By the 10th hanging, these details fade into routine, as unremarkable as the baker's daily rounds or the chiming of the church bell. The mind, overwhelmed by the horror of the initial experience, gradually builds calluses around its sensitivities. Modern studies of emergency room, doctors and war correspondents reveal the same phenomenon. What shocks eventually becomes mundane through repeated exposure. The execution sleepers were simply ahead of the curve, having mastered the art of emotional detachment through sheer repetition. Cognitive dissonance plays an equally important role. The average execution spectator likely considered themselves a decent, God-fearing individual, not the sort who would take pleasure in another's suffering. Sleeping through the event allowed them to maintain this self-image while still attending the spectacle. They could truthfully say they've been present for the hanging without having actually witnessed the death. Modern parallels abound. The shareholder who votes for ethical policies then ignores corporate misconduct. The voter who supports humanitarian causes but averts their eyes from refugee crises. The psychology remains identical. Physical presence without mental engagement allows us to have our moral cake without digesting its uncomfortable ingredients. Then there is the matter of perceived control. Faced with an execution they could not stop, spectators often subconsciously chose indifference as the only available form of resistance. If one cannot prevent a hanging, one can at least refuse to give it the satisfaction of one's attention. This same logic drives modern avoidance of distressing news. Since the individual cannot single-handedly stop wars or solve poverty, they instead stop listening to reports about them. The execution sleepers might have been early practitioners of what psychologists now call compassion fatigue, that very modern exhaustion from caring too much about too many things beyond one's control. Social dynamics further reinforce this behavior. In crowds, responsibility diffuses, allowing individuals to disengage more easily than they might alone. The same person who would gasp at a hanging witnessed in solitude might easily doze through one experienced as part of a jostling, chatting crowd. Modern social media creates similar conditions. The endless scroll of tragedies and injustices becomes background noise when everyone else treats it as such. A single death may be a tragedy, but 1,000 deaths become statistics, and 1,000,000 deaths become content to scroll past while waiting for coffee. Evolutionary biology offers its own explanations. Our ancestors survived by focusing on immediate threats, the approaching lion, the rotting food, not distant or abstract dangers. The execution, however horrifying, posed no direct threat to spectators, making it easier for weary minds to classify as non-essential information. Modern humans retain this wiring, which explains why we can ignore existential threats like climate change while obsessing over trivial social slights. The brain still prioritizes the metaphorical lion over the theoretical famine, even when the famine is decidedly more imminent. Personality types also factor into avoidance behavior. Psychologists identify a category they term repressors, individuals who instinctively avoid negative stimuli. Where some people lean forward to examine an execution's details, repressors look away, daydream, or yes, fall asleep. These differences persist today in how people consume news, some devouring every detail of disasters, others changing the channel at the first hint of unpleasantness. The execution sleepers may have been history's first documented repressors, their naps representing not mere fatigue, but an entire psychological strategy for managing distress. The theater of execution itself encouraged certain forms of detachment. The ritualized aspects, the procession, the prayers, the formal speeches, created psychological distance between the act and its reality. Modern bureaucracies achieve similar effects with paperwork and procedures, allowing drone operators and accountants alike to focus on process rather than consequence. An execution becomes just another item on the day's agenda when sandwiched between breakfast and market shopping, much as modern professionals compartmentalize meetings about layoffs between coffee breaks and lunch play. Childhood exposure played its part too. Many execution spectators had been attending such events since infancy, their young minds normalizing what should have been horrifying. Modern children similarly grow accustomed to seeing violence through screens, becoming desensitized through repeated exposure. The difference lies only in the resolution. Where our ancestors saw real but distant hangings, we see vivid but fictional murders, with much the same numbing effect on our sensitivities. Economic factors cannot be ignored. For many working-class spectators, execution days offered rare time off from dawn to dusk labor. Their exhaustion was literal as much as psychological, their bodies seizing the chance to rest wherever possible. Modern workers similarly disengage during downtime, binging trivial entertainment as mental respite from demanding jobs. The sleepers at executions were perhaps less morally deficient than simply overtired, predecessors to today's commuters dozing through their subway stops after 60-hour workweek. Cultural narratives shaped avoidance too. Church teachings about the afterlife could make execution seem like mere transition rather than true ending. The condemned was off to meet his maker, not vanishing into nothingness. Why lose sleep over that? Modern secular narratives achieve similar effects with abstract statistics and euphemistic language that sanitizes uncomfortable realities. Collateral damage sounds far more palatable than dead children. Justice ascended to heaven sounds better than strangled to death at the end of a rope. The execution sleepers ultimately represent a fundamental truth about human psychology. We are built more for survival than for truth, more for comfort than for awareness. Our minds protect us not by relentlessly confronting harsh realities, but by strategically avoiding them when possible. The same mechanism that allowed a medieval peasant to nap through a hanging allows a modern executive to ignore poverty statistics, not out of malice, but out of an ancient ingrained programming that prioritizes immediate well-being over abstract concerns. This explains why moral appeals often fail to sustain attention. Just as preachers' warnings about damnation became background noise at executions, modern warnings about societal collapse often fail to penetrate our psychological defenses. The mind has an endless capacity for treating existential threats as someone else's problem, some other time's concern. The execution sleepers didn't truly believe the condemned's fate could be their own, just as modern drivers don't truly believe climate change will affect their lifetimes. Abstract consequences, however severe, struggle to compete with immediate comforts. Yet avoidance comes at a cost. The execution sleepers missed opportunities for genuine reflection, for questioning systems of justice, for developing more humane alternatives. Their modern counterparts similarly missed chances to address looming crises while solutions remain possible. Psychological defenses that once protected individuals from temporary distress now threaten collective survival in the face of mounting global challenges. Perhaps the final irony lies in how avoidance ultimately fails. However skillfully one looks away, reality persists. The execution sleepers still heard the drop of the trapdoor in their dreams. The modern avoider still glimpses troubling headlines between cat videos. Complete detachment proves impossible. The mind registers what the conscious self denies. The hanged man intrudes upon the nap. The climate crisis interrupts the scrolling. The repressed always returns. In the end, the sleeping spectators at executions embody a paradox central to the human condition. We cannot bear too much reality, but neither can we entirely escape it. Our psychological defenses both protect and limit us, enabling daily functioning while preventing full engagement. The challenge, then as now, is finding the balance between necessary detachment and willful blindness to occasionally open one's eyes during the performance, even if the view is distressing. After all, the executioner never sleeps, whether we watch his work or not. Chapter 15. Execution merchandise and souvenirs. Public executions did more than just entertain and educate. They created thriving microeconomies where death became a commodity. Vendors circled through the crowds like carrion birds, hawking everything from commemorative pamphlets to alleged fragments of the noose, turning judicial killings into full-spectrum consumer experiences. Yet even this bustling marketplace couldn't always keep spectators engaged, as evidenced by the many sleepers who dozed through executions while clutching souvenir executioner figurines or with half-eaten meat pies staining their laps. The history of execution merchandise reveals as much about human nature as the executions themselves. Our ability to commercialize anything, and our equal capacity to grow bored even with the most macabre novelties. The most common execution keepsakes were printed materials. Broadside ballads recounting the criminal's deeds sold briskly, often embellished with dramatic woodcuts of the hanging. These primitive programs sometimes included helpful marginalia like the condemned's last meal or amusing quotes from the trial. Printers often prepared multiple versions in advance, one for if the prisoner showed remorse, another for defiance, creating what might be history's first example of pre-written news coverage. The truly sophisticated might purchase bound editions collecting multiple criminal stories, creating a sort of greatest hits album of local executions. That many spectators used these pamphlets as makeshift pillows during lengthy pre-hanging sermons speaks volumes about the disposable nature of even the most sensational literature. For those seeking more tangible mementos, vendors offered fragments of the scaffold or rope. These relics supposedly carried protective powers, though their authenticity was dubious at best. A single execution might produce enough genuine noose fibers to rig a frigate, suggesting either miraculous rope extension or rampant fraud. Wealthier patrons could purchase miniature replicas of the gallows, some with working trapdoors, the Georgian era's equivalent of action figures. The 1742 Diary of a London Merchant records, giving his son a Tyburn toy with moving parts as a birthday gift, though whether this reflected poor parenting or period-appropriate values remains unclear. Food and drink formed another major market sector. Roasted nuts, meat pies, and gingerbread were staples, often shaped into macabre forms for the occasion. Accounts describe gingerbread men with edible nooses, pies decorated with crossbones, and cakes iced with gallows motifs. Vendors strategically positioned themselves near the execution site's most crowded areas, though this sometimes backfired when falling bodily fluids contaminated their wares. 1703 lawsuit revealed one baker had been recycling unsold execution pastries as communion bread, leading to the unfortunate combination of a priest intoning the body of Christ while parishioners bit into criminally hardened crusts. Clothing and accessories rounded out the commercial offerings. Mourning rings featuring the condemned's hair enjoyed periodic popularity, despite the logistical challenges of collection. More practical were execution-themed handkerchiefs, useful both for dabbing tears and shielding noses from unpleasant odors. The truly fashionable might sport jewelry incorporating miniature portraits of famous criminals, though this trend dwindled after several aristocrats were embarrassed to realize their latest necklace depicted a man who'd murdered someone they knew. For the budget-conscious, simple ribbons in execution, black or murderers, red allowed participation in the sartorial moment without excessive expenditure. The most bizarre merchandise capitalized on supposed magical properties. Executioners' gloves were said to cure ailments when rubbed on affected areas. Pieces of the hanging tree could ward off evil spirits. Even the dirt from beneath the gallows found buyers, despite its dubious distinction of possibly containing assorted biological residues. Apothecaries did brisk business in Tyburn water, allegedly collected from puddles near the scaffold, though the smart money says most came from the nearest well with some creative labeling. That people slept through executions while clutching these dubious talismans suggests their faith in magical protection outweighed their interest in the actual events, supposedly imbuing these objects with power. Children weren't excluded from this commercial frenzy. Toy makers produced miniature gallows with adjustable nooses, though these occasionally caused scandal when young aristocrats used them on their sisters' dolls. Board games like Hangman's Gambit taught strategy through simulated executions, while jigsaw puzzles depicted famous criminals in charming poses. The 18th century equivalent of trading cards featured colorful portraits of infamous murderers, with particularly notorious criminals commanding premium value on playgrounds across Europe. Many of these items survive in museum collections today, their cheerful colors belying their grim inspirations. The rise of celebrity criminals created particularly lucrative merchandising opportunities. Famous highwaymen like Dick Turpin inspired everything from commemorative plates to snuff boxes bearing their likenesses. The trial of murderer William Corder spawned so much merchandise that one newspaper complained it was impossible to buy a teacup without the villain's face staring back. Execution attendees could purchase these items before, during, and after the main event, creating a commercial experience that extended far beyond the fatal moment itself. That many spectators napped through the actual hanging while clutching these souvenirs suggests the merchandise often eclipsed its inspiration and popularity. Religious paraphernalia formed its own subcategory. Vendors sold miniature Bibles approved for use at executions, though their small print made them equally useful for kindling fires. Crucifixes allegedly touched to the condemned's lips commanded premium prices, as did prayer cards supposedly carried by famous criminals. The line between sanctity and commerce blurred thoroughly, with one enterprising priest in 1690s Paris selling guaranteed absolution certificates that spectators could present to the condemned for signing, a sort of macabre autograph hounding with theological pretensions. The most disturbing merchandise involved direct connections to the executed. Besides the aforementioned hair jewelry, collectors sought fingernail clippings, teeth, and in some cases, preserved body parts. The infamous case of murderer Jonathan Wild inspired such demand that guards reportedly had to prevent spectators from taking bites out of his corpse. While these grim trophies attracted the most attention, they represented a small fraction of overall sales. Most spectators preferred their death souvenirs sanitized and symbolic rather than literal and fleshy. Merchandise quality varied dramatically by price point. The wealthy could commission exquisite miniature portraits of the condemned in ivory, while the poor made do with rough woodcuts on cheap paper. A surviving 1784 inventory from a London execution vendor lists everything from silver-mounted noose fragments to penny scraps of dubious provenance. This stratification mirrored execution attendance itself, where the wealthy occupied cushioned seats while the poor jostled for standing room at the back. Both groups, however, seemed equally prone to dozing off when proceedings dragged, proving fatigue respected class boundaries. The commercial frenzy often overshadowed the executions themselves. Diaries and letters frequently mention purchases made at hangings, but omit details of the deaths, suggesting for many the shopping formed the main attraction. One society matron's detailed account of acquiring the most cunning little hangman figurine devotes exactly one sentence to the actual execution it commemorated. The modern equivalent might be buying concert merch while ignoring the band, though with significantly higher stakes for the performers involved. Entrepreneur constantly innovated to maintain spectator interest. One vendor in 1720s, Paris offered execution weather vanes that supposedly pointed toward the nearest gallows. Another sold scented candles with fragrances like rope hemp and prison damp. The most cynical might produce fake last confessions of famous criminals, though these occasionally backfired when the supposedly dead felon turned out to be literate enough to object from the afterlife they were meant to have entered. Children's education became another marketing angle. Morality pamphlets used executions as cautionary tales, their gruesome illustrations belying their pious messages. ABC books taught letters through executions. A is for axeman, B is for brigand, while counting primers used dangling bodies for arithmetic practice. That generations of children fell asleep to these grim lessons suggests even juvenile minds have limits to what they'll absorb before seeking escape in dreams. The decline of public executions didn't end the merchandising impulse, it simply migrated. True crime books, murderabilia collections, and dark tourism souvenirs continue the tradition in sanitized form. Modern enthusiasts might purchase serial killer trading cards or tour Jack the Ripper's haunts, proving the human appetite for commodified violence persists even as its expressions grow more abstract. The sleepers have migrated too, now dozing through murder podcasts or true crime documentaries rather than public hangings. The merchandise outlasts the event, the commercial impulse proving more durable than any one method of judicial killing. Perhaps the final irony lies in how these objects often survived their original owners. Museums now preserve execution memorabilia in climate-controlled cases, the very items meant as disposable mementos having become historical artifacts. The pamphlets used as pillows, the handkerchiefs that dabbed at bored tears, the miniature gallows given as gifts, all now merit scholarly study and careful conservation. In the end, the merchandise proved more enduring than the moments it commemorated, just as human curiosity about death outlasts any individual demise. The sleeping spectators may have missed the show, but their souvenirs keep its memory alive, however faded by time and commerce. Chapter 16. The Rise of Alternative Entertainment. Public executions never truly disappeared because society became more humane, but rather because they grew dull in comparison to newer, flashier diversions. The same spectators who once jostled for prime viewing positions at the Gallows gradually found their attention captured by pantomimes and puppet shows, just as modern audiences migrate from one digital distraction to the next. The decline of execution crowds tells a story not of moral awakening, but of entertainment inflation. The perpetual human craving for ever more stimulation rendered even death spectacles insufficiently engaging. The hangman's loss was the impresario's gain, as society discovered it preferred its violence fictionalized, its tragedies staged, and its moral lessons delivered with catchy musical numbers. The first cracks in execution's cultural monopoly appeared with the rise of commercial theaters, where medieval morality plays had complemented public hangings by reinforcing their lessons. Elizabethan drama offered an irresistible alternative. All the violence and moralizing, but with better costumes and the option to leave early for supper. By the time Shakespeare's Globe opened, Londoners could choose between watching Falstaff pretend to die with comic aplomb, or some actual thief twitch at the end of a rope, and increasingly, they chose the former. Theaters provided death without consequences, morality without obligation, and most importantly, comfortable seating that didn't smell of unwashed peasants. That groundlings still occasionally doze through performances suggests even the bard couldn't always compete with human fatigue, but at least the snoring occurred during soliloquies rather than final words. Pleasure gardens offered another formidable competitor. These sprawling entertainment complexes combined music, fireworks, exotic animals, and elaborate fountains, a multimedia experience that made the static Gallows seem quaint by comparison. Vauxhall Gardens became particularly famous for its ruined abbey attraction, where visitors could enjoy faux Gothic decay without the inconvenience of actual death or religious contemplation. The garden's nighttime illumination displays drew crowds that might previously have attended executions, proving people preferred artificial wonders to authentic suffering when given the choice. That pleasure garden patrons still occasionally napped on benches after too much claret merely continued the tradition of spectators sleeping through public spectacles, albeit in more picturesque surroundings. The rise of organized sports further diluted execution's appeal. Where once men had wagered on how many times a hanged man would twitch, they now bet on horses, prize fights, and cricket matches. Blood sports like bear baiting and cockfighting provided visceral thrills without the pesky moral ambiguity of watching an actual human die. Sporting events had other advantages over executions. They occurred more regularly, featured multiple participants, and crucially, didn't end with someone's eternal damnation. The gambler who once placed side bets on execution outcomes could now lose his shirt several times a week at the racetrack instead. Progress by any measure. Novelty acts and traveling shows upped the ante with ever more outrageous spectacles. Fire eaters, contortionists, and living skeletons made ordinary hangings seem pedestrian by comparison. The famous showman, Philip Astley, pioneered modern circus entertainment just as executions were declining, offering death-defying horsemanship as a family-friendly alternative to death-accepting felons. By the early 1800s, people could watch a man ride two horses while juggling flaming torches, an act that rendered the simple drop of a trapdoor embarrassingly low-tech. The same audiences that once gasped at hangings now yawned unless the performer risked actual dismemberment. Scientific demonstrations and public lectures siphoned off the more intellectually inclined spectators. Where executions had offered crude anatomy lessons via dismemberment, now proper anatomical theaters provided detailed dissections with educational commentary. The fashionable set who once attended hangings for macabre thrills could now enjoy equally gruesome but more socially respectable displays of galvanized frog legs and electrical experiments. Even the most dedicated execution enthusiasts had to admit that a well-presented demonstration of laughing gas beat watching some pickpocket's bowels spill during his drawing and quartering. The printing revolution created private alternatives to public spectacle. Cheap newspapers offered lurid crime reports that readers could enjoy without leaving home, while serialized novels provided fictionalized mayhem with complex plots and character development. Why stand for hours in the rain watching a real hanging when one could lounge in bed reading about imaginary murders? The rise of lending libraries meant even the poor could access sensational literature, making the gallows seem redundant as a storytelling medium. That readers sometimes fell asleep over these books merely transferred the tradition of execution napping to more comfortable surroundings. Industrialization reshaped leisure time and attention spans. Factory workers with limited free time preferred more reliable entertainments than the sporadic scheduling of executions. The emerging middle class sought respectable diversions that didn't involve rubbing shoulders with the rabble at hanging days. Children who might once have been taken to executions for moral instruction now visited museums or zoos instead. The entire culture of public spectacle shifted toward more organized, predictable forms of entertainment, better suited to industrial society's schedules and sensibilities. Transportation advances allowed people to escape execution crowds altogether. Railways made seaside excursions possible for even modest incomes, offering fresh air and wholesome fun as an alternative to the stench and chaos of execution days. The same working-class families who might once have made hanging days their primary outing could now take day trips to resort towns, where the only spectacles were Punch and Judy shows and the occasional fainting Victorian lady. That passengers often slept on train rides home continued the proud tradition of dozing through divertissements, just with better upholstery. The rise of music halls and vaudeville delivered the final blow to execution's entertainment value. These variety shows combined song, dance, comedy, and drama into packages expressly designed to prevent audience boredom, something executions had never managed. A well-programmed music hall bill changed acts every 15 minutes to maintain interest, while executions stubbornly persisted with their single-act structure, culminating in irreversible finale. Performers developed the art of audience engagement just as executioners bemoaned declining crowd sizes, proving people preferred participatory entertainment to passive observation, unless the participation involved actual blood spatter. Photography and other visual technologies rendered public executions obsolete as spectacle. Why watch a distant hanging when magic lantern shows could bring magnified images of exotic locales right to one's hometown? Early cinematography captured reenactments of famous crimes that were both more dramatic and better lit than their real-life counterparts. The Lumiere brothers' first films included staged comic scenes that offered death-free thrills, establishing a pattern that would dominate visual entertainment forever after. Audiences could now experience the illusion of danger without the moral discomfort of actual mortality, though they still sometimes napped through screenings, proving some traditions transcend technological change. The parallel to modern digital distractions is inescapable. Just as 19th century audiences abandoned hangings for moving pictures, today's viewers migrate from traditional media to ever more personalized content streams. The smartphone accomplishes what pleasure gardens and circuses began, providing endless novelty without demanding physical presence at unpleasant events. Modern parallels to execution, sleepers doze not at the gallows, but with Netflix autoplaying into the night, having traded one form of passive spectatorship for another. Our attention spans, if anything, have grown even shorter than those of our execution-watching ancestors, who at least could focus for the duration of a hanging speech before losing interest. The ultimate irony lies in how contemporary true crime entertainment has come full circle. Podcasts dissect murders with the same lurid fascination that once drew crowds to hangings. Documentary series recreate infamous crimes with production values Philip Astley could only dream of. Even execution itself has become entertainment again, with historical reenactments and virtual reality experiences, allowing people to safely sample what their ancestors endured. The sleepers have migrated from physical crowds to digital ones, dozing off during murder documentaries instead of public hangings, but the fundamental dynamic remains unchanged. Human curiosity about mortality persists, even as its expressions grow more mediated and distanced. In the end, executions didn't disappear because humanity became more civilized, but because we invented better ways to be uncivilized. The same impulses that drew crowds to the gallows now drive clicks on murder stories. We've simply outsourced our bloodlust to actors and algorithms. The sleepers who once napped through hangings now scroll half-consciously through true crime forums, proving that while technology changes, human nature remains comfortingly consistent. The execution crowd's descendants aren't morally superior, just more comfortably distracted. A lullaby for the condemned. Gather close, dear spectators, and let me tell you a soothing tale to ease you into slumber on this most eventful of nights. Tomorrow comes the hanging, and you'll want to be well rested for the festivities. So nestle into your straw, adjust your neck cushion, and let the distant creak of the gallows being tested rock you gently toward dreams as sweet as a condemned man's last meal. Once upon a time, though not very long ago, and probably in this very town, there lived a man much like the one who will dangle before you come morning. His crimes matter not, for they were surely dreadful, else he wouldn't have earned such prime positioning at tomorrow's event. What matters is that he too faced the long walk up the wooden stairs, the scratch of rough hemp against his stubbled neck, the moment when the world drops away beneath one's feet. And yet he slept the night before soundly as a babe, thanks to a special story whispered to him by the jailer's kind-hearted daughter. You see, dear dozers, executions are like bedtimes. They come for us all eventually. Some sooner than others, true, but that simply means those lucky souls get to avoid the tedious build-up. The clever ones learn to treat the scaffold as just another bed, albeit one with more dramatic drapery. So let us consider how we might make tomorrow's entertainment more restful for all involved, especially those of us who struggle to stay awake during the duller prayers and speeches. First, imagine the noose as but a cradle's mobile, swaying gently in the morning breeze. Each twist of the rope becomes a dancing puppet to delight tired eyes, rather than a grim instrument of finality. The hangman's knot, so carefully tied, resembles nothing so much as a child's shoelace, though admittedly one tied with rather more permanent consequences. Even the trapdoor below can be envisioned as merely a large cupboard where bad dreams are stored, waiting to spring open and swallow them whole. The condemned man himself makes for an excellent sleep aid, if viewed correctly. His raspy last words become a soothing white noise to drown out life's petty distractions. His trembling hands trace patterns in the air as hypnotic as any nursery rhyme's gestures. Even his inevitable final evacuation, while unpleasant, serves as a reminder that we all empty ourselves before true rest, some just more publicly than others. For those requiring more concrete relaxation techniques, one might count the scaffold's nails instead of sheep. Each iron spike represents another worry being firmly pounded out of consciousness. The grain forms natural patterns for the mind to follow downward into slumber, while the occasional blood stain from previous performances adds just enough color to keep things interesting without being overstimulating. Why, so are you? The crowd's murmurs transform into a mother's shushing when properly appreciated. That drunken lout shouting obscenities, merely an overexcited toddler resisting bedtime. The sobbing woman at the front, a lullaby sung slightly off-key. Even the executioner's dour expression becomes a comforting constant, like a beloved nursemaid's frown when the children resist their necessary rest. Should you still struggle to drift off, consider the deeper philosophy of the hanging hour. Morning executions were scheduled not for cruelty, but to allow all parties an early resolution and the chance for spectators to continue with their day's business. What is this but the ultimate power nap, a brief interruption of life's flow to observe death's efficiency before returning to one's shopping? The condemned man's swift journey from vertical to horizontal mirrors our own desired trajectory toward comfortable repose. The similarity between beds and coffins has been oft noted by philosophers, but rarely have they considered the gallows as simply an upright version of both. The sleeping spectator who nods off during the proceedings might be said to be more attuned to this truth than his wide-awake neighbors. His snoring provides the proper soundtrack to mortality's comedy, a raspberry blown at death's pretensions to gravity. Children understand this instinctively, which explains why they so often doze through executions despite their elders' insistence that they pay attention to the moral lesson. The young know that all spectacles eventually become boring, and that sleep is the ultimate rebellion against expectations. The boy who naps through his first hanging has grasped a truth that eludes most adults. It's all just show business, and the wise spectator conserves his energy for better entertainments. Even the afterlife can be reconceptualized for better sleep hygiene. Heaven becomes an eternal featherbed, hell merely a restless night of overheated tossing and turning. Purgatory offers the middling satisfaction of a decent but unremarkable inn mattress. And oblivion, the dreamless sleep we all secretly crave after too many nights of vivid, unsettling dream. So close your eyes now, dear spectators, and let tomorrow's events play softly behind your lids like a familiar bedtime story. The condemned man has practiced his lines, the hangman has starched his hood, and the rope has been stretched to just the right tension. All will proceed with or without your vigilant attention. Your presence is required, but your consciousness is optional, a truth the cleverest spectators have always understood. When dawn comes, and they lead you to the square, remember that between each heartbeat lies a tiny moment perfect for napping. The prayers will still be there when you wake, the speech is no more profound for having been heard in full. Even the drop itself lasts but an instant. Blink, and you'll miss it. Doze, and you'll avoid it entirely. The truly enlightened spectator knows that sleeping through an execution is the highest form of philosophical detachment, a refusal to grant death more attention than it deserves. And so, as the moon climbs over the jailhouse and the rats begin their nightly gallows inspection, let us all take comfort in knowing that tomorrow's entertainment will proceed exactly as planned whether we watch it or not. The condemned will die, the crowd will disperse, and life will continue much as before. The only real variable is how well rested we choose to be for the occasion. Sleep well then, dear spectators, and dream of gentle swinging motions and distant fading cries. Tomorrow's death can wait until you've had your proper rest. Chapter 18. The Ethics of Spectatorship. The moral quandary of execution attendance presents itself as a series of nested dilemmas, like a set of wooden dolls, each more uncomfortable than the last. At the outermost layer sits the fundamental question: is it worse to watch a man die with rapt attention, or to doze through his final moments with a slack jaw and intermittent snoring? The answer, as with most ethical conundrums, depends largely on whether one considers indifference or fascination the greater sin. Our ancestors, bless their conflicted souls, managed to cultivate both simultaneously, perfecting the art of appearing deeply engaged while mentally composing shopping lists. Philosophically speaking, the attentive spectator at least demonstrates respect for the gravity of the occasion. They acknowledge the solemnity of state-sanctioned killing by bearing witness, much as one might sit through a tedious opera out of respect for the art form. The sleeper, by contrast, treats human extinction as background noise, which, while honest, does rather undermine the whole deterrent aspect of public execution. What good is hanging a man before thousands if half of them use the event to catch up on sleep? The condemned might reasonably feel slighted that his grand finale couldn't hold his audience's attention better than a mediocre sermon on a warm afternoon. Yet the ethics grow murkier upon closer examination. The wide-awake spectator often attends for less than noble reasons: morbid curiosity, bloodlust, or the Victorian equivalent of needing content for their social media. The sleeper at least isn't deriving pleasure from the proceedings, unless one counts the joy of a good nap, which seems forgivable. Furthermore, the alert attendee's detailed recollection of the event perpetuates its violence through retelling, while the sleeper's memory offers the condemned a kind of secondary oblivion. In this light, snoring through an execution becomes almost an act of mercy, a refusal to grant death more celebrity than it deserves. Religious authorities historically disagreed on the morality of execution sleep. Puritan ministers argued that dozing through hangings showed disrespect for divine justice, while certain Catholic theologians maintained that a well-timed nap could demonstrate admirable detachment from worldly concerns. The debate reached its absurd zenith in 1673, when a Cambridge don published a 300-page treatise arguing that Adam had likely slept through the first animal sacrifice, thus establishing biblical precedent for inattention during ritual killing. The Anglican Church condemned the work as heresy, though records suggest several bishops found its arguments distressingly persuasive during particularly lengthy execution sermons. The condemned themselves held predictably strong opinions on spectator etiquette. Some prisoners reportedly cursed dozing onlookers, while others seemed flattered that their deaths provided such comfort. The infamous highwayman, Thomas Brightwell, allegedly told a snoring spectator in 1731, "I'm glad my final performance proved so restful, though I wish you'd paid half as well for tickets as you're paying in SEZ." Contrast this with murderer Eliza Fenwick, who in 1789 spat at a sleeping matron before telling the hangman, "At least someone here will meet death with their eyes closed." Legal scholars of the era tied themselves in knots, determining whether spectator sleep constituted contempt of court. Some argued that since executions represented the final stage of judicial proceedings, inattention undermined the justice system's authority. Others countered that sleep was a natural function beyond legal regulation, a position strengthened after a 1714 case, where a judge himself nodded off during a hanging and had to be woken to confirm the prisoner was dead. The compromise solution saw sleepers technically liable for fines, but rarely prosecuted, establishing the useful precedent that the law need not concern itself with every nap taken in public. Medical authorities contributed their own perplexing perspective. Victorian physicians warned that excessive attention to executions could overstimulate the nerves, while too much sleep during such events might indicate dangerous apathy. The recommended approach was moderate engagement, enough observation to satisfy civic duty, sufficient detachment to preserve one's constitution. This balanced approach explains why so many execution accounts describe spectators who alternated between keen interest and sudden bouts of yawning, their bodies instinctively self-regulating moral exposure like epistemological sunscreen. Modern psychology would likely diagnose the execution sleeper as employing an avoidance coping mechanism, though our ancestors simply called it common sense. Faced with the cognitive dissonance of being fundamentally decent people who nevertheless enjoyed watching others die, many spectators' minds chose the path of least resistance: partial disengagement. The same phenomenon occurs today when people scroll past distressing news or change the subject from uncomfortable truths. Humans have always been masters of selective attention. Our ancestors just practiced it with fewer screens and more bodily fluids. The economic perspective offers perhaps the most cynical analysis. Spectators who slept through execution still counted toward crowd numbers, justifying the expense of maintaining gallows and paying executioners. Their presence, however unconscious, contributed to the deterrent effect by demonstrating community participation. In this light, The sleeper performed a valuable civic function simply by warming a bench, much like modern shareholders who doze through annual meetings but still count toward quorum. The system required bodies more than alert minds, making ethical qualms about attention spans largely irrelevant to the machinery of justice. Artists and writers have long grappled with the spectator ethics question. Shakespeare's groundlings, who chatted through tragic scenes, Dickens' courtroom sketch artists who prioritized a good composition over human suffering, Orwell's execution attendees more concerned with their dogs than the condemned, all recognize humanity's capacity for detachment in the face of others' pain. The sleeping execution spectator represents merely the purest expression of this universal tendency, their slack features and drooping chin embodying our collective skill at looking away when reality becomes inconvenient. Contemporary parallels abound. The modern equivalent might be citizens who dutifully vote but never raid past political headlines, or consumers who wear ethically sourced clothing while ignoring its production chains. We've refined our ancestors' techniques of selective attention into an art form, maintaining just enough engagement to satisfy our self-image while avoiding the discomfort of true awareness. The execution sleeper's yawn echoes in every half-read news alert, every scrolled past humanitarian crisis, every muted conversation about uncomfortable truths. Perhaps the most unsettling realization is that the sleepers may have been the most morally consistent attendees. Their naps declared plainly what others concealed behind pretenses of justice or moral instruction. That executions were ultimately about them, the living, not the dying. The alert spectator could lie to themselves about civic duty. The sleeper admitted they were really just there for something to do. In an odd way, their indifference honored the condemned more than false piety, treating them as human enough to be boring rather than symbols in some grand moral drama. The ethics of spectatorship ultimately reduced to a simple but uncomfortable question. Is it better to watch suffering badly or not to watch at all? Our ancestors answered with glorious inconsistency, attending executions but napping through them, bearing witness while mentally absent, participating in communal violence while dreaming of tea and crumpets. We've inherited their cognitive dissonance, if not their gallows, finding ever more sophisticated ways to be present without paying attention. The methods change, but the central contradiction endures. We know we should care. We wish to appear as though we care. But oh, how sweet it is to close our eyes just for a moment and let the world's horrors pass us by. Chapter 19. Modern Parallels to Public Executions. The town square gallows may have disappeared, but the human appetite for public punishment never truly faded. It simply migrated to digital platforms with better catering options. Where our ancestors gathered to watch criminals dance at rope's end, we now congregate around trending hashtags to witness careers and reputations being metaphorically hanged, drawn, and quartered with emoji reactions. The similarities between historical executions and contemporary cancel culture reveal more than we might comfortably admit about our enduring thirst for communal justice, served with a side of entertainment. The main difference? Today's spectators can participate in the spectacle without leaving their sofas or pausing their Netflix binge. Consider first the ritual similarities. Just as prisoners were paraded through jeering crowds to the scaffold, modern cancellations begin with the digital perp walk, that gratifying moment when screenshots of problematic tweets circulate through social media like a condemned man's crimes being read aloud to the mob. The accused's attempts at apology often mirror the forced confessions of old, with similar levels of sincerity and equal likelihood of appeasing the crowd. And the moment when the metaphorical trapdoor opens, careers ended, sponsorships revoked, book deals cancelled, produces the same visceral thrill as the snap of a well-tied noose, just without the messy cleanup afterward. The role of vendors has been neatly updated for the digital age. Where execution crowds once purchased pamphlets detailing criminals' misdeeds, we now subscribe to YouTube drama channels and Patreon gossip mills. Merch tables selling miniature gallows have been replaced by merch stores hawking canceled t-shirts and problematic fave mugs. Even the food vendors survive in spirit. How many viral takedowns have we consumed while mindlessly chewing through bags of chips, our attention divided between someone's public immolation and the quest for the next crunchy bite? The sleepers, too, have their modern equivalents. Just as execution crowds contain spectators who doze through the main event, today's digital mobs include half-attentive participants who retweet condemnation threads they haven't fully read, or add their names to petitions while barely glancing at the allegations. The phenomenon of performative wokeness often involves precisely this kind of sleepy engagement. Enough activity to maintain social standing, not enough attention to grasp nuances or question narratives. Our ancestors napped through hangings. We scroll mindlessly through cancellations, both maintaining the pretense of participation while conserving our emotional energy. Public executions always serve multiple purposes: justice, deterrence, entertainment, and so too do modern cancellations. The righteous satisfaction of seeing wrongdoers punished scratches the same itch whether the punishment involves literal or professional death. The deterrent effect operates similarly too, with ambitious souls everywhere carefully policing their words and actions lest they find themselves trending for all the wrong reasons. Even the entertainment value remains consistent. Why watch a beheading when you can watch a celebrity's 15-year-old tweets resurface with accompanying commentary more savage than any executioner's acts? The class dynamics persist in updated forms. Where the aristocracy once watched executions from special balconies, today's elite observe cancellations from verified Twitter accounts, their blue checkmarks serving as the digital equivalent of velvet-lined viewing boxes. The working classes once jostled for position at the foot of the gallows, now they mass in comment sections and subreddits. And just as execution crowds contain both genuine moral crusaders and bloodthirsty thrill-seekers, so too do cancellation mobs mingle sincere activists with those simply there for the drama. The duration of punishment has inverted intriguingly. Historical executions offered swift, brutal finality, while modern cancellations often involve prolonged professional suffocation. The digital equivalent of being left to dangle in the gibbet for months or years. Where our ancestors measured suffering in minutes, we calibrate ours in lost opportunities and dwindling follower counts. Some might argue this represents progress, though the condemned of old might have preferred a quick drop to watching their Amazon ratings plummet in real time. The role of children in these spectacles reveals another parallel. Just as parents once brought offspring to hangings for moral instruction, today's adults expose children to viral shamings as object lessons in proper behavior. See What Happened to That YouTuber has replaced See What Happens to Thieves as the go-to parental warning. The results are similarly mixed. Some children absorb genuine ethical lessons. Others simply learn to hide their transgressions more carefully. The sleepers of yore who doze through executions now have modern counterparts in teens who scroll past cancellation drama to return to memes, equally uninterested in the moral theater adults find so compelling. The aftermarket for execution, Souvenirs, finds its mirror in cancellation culture's peripheral industries. Where pieces of the hangman's rope were once prized possessions, now screenshots of deleted apologies and archival footage of problematic statements circulate as collector's items. Reaction channels dissect falls from grace with the same attention to detail as execution broadsheets once documented final words and bodily twitches. Even the macabre trade in criminal relics continues through auction sites selling props from cancelled productions or signed memorabilia from disgraced celebrities. Religious overtones persist as well. The execution sermon's descendant is the think piece, both serving to contextualize punishment within broader moral frameworks. Where priests once interpreted a criminal's death as evidence of divine justice, pundits now analyze cancellations as proof of societal progress or decline, depending on their leanings. The public confession has evolved from scaffold statements to notes app apologies, though both share similar qualities of forced contrition and careful audience calculation. The randomness of selection for public punishment remains strikingly consistent. Just as execution crowds might contain equally guilty parties who simply hadn't been caught, modern cancellation waves often leave equally problematic figures untouched while making examples of others. The capriciousness of viral attention mirrors the arbitrary nature of historical law enforcement. Some hang for stealing bread while others dine with the king. Some lose careers over decade-old jokes while others survive fresh allegations. In both systems, luck plays as much role as justice in determining who faces the crowd's wrath. Perhaps most telling is how both systems create their own forms of celebrity. Notorious criminals once attracted crowds of admirers and groupies, just as cancelled figures often develop devoted followings of contrarians and defenders. The highwayman waving to adoring fans as he approaches the gallows finds his counterpart in the influencer live tweeting their cancellation with defiant humor. In some cases, public punishment even enhances the victim's fame. Many historical criminals became more popular after execution, just as some modern figures find cancellation boosts their visibility, if not their credibility. The sleepers in both systems ultimately serve as a reminder of human nature's resistance to sustained moral outrage. Our ancestors' ability to nap through hangings foreshadowed our own tendency to disengage from even the juiciest scandals once they grow stale. The execution spectator, who missed the fatal drop because he was adjusting his stockings, differs little from the Twitter user who ignores cancellation drama to check sports scores. Both demonstrate that no spectacle, however dramatic, can hold attention indefinitely against the constant pull of personal concerns and simple boredom. In the end, the transition from physical to digital punishment represents less a break from tradition than an upgrade in delivery system. We've traded the tangible for the virtual, the visceral for the discursive, but the underlying dynamics remain stubbornly familiar. The crowds still gather, the accused still tremble, the vendors still hawk their wares. We've simply eliminated the smell of unwashed bodies and the need for good weather. Progress, it seems, means being able to destroy a life from the comfort of one's own home, without even having to put down one's snack. The sleeping spectators of old would surely approve of such convenience, even as they dozed through its implementation. Chapter 20. Why you should stay awake, even if you'd rather not. The condemned man always keeps his eyes wide open as they lead him to the scaffold. However drunk or drugged or resigned he may be, some primal instinct prevents his eyelids from drooping in those final moments. His audience, by contrast, must work consciously to maintain the same level of alertness, fighting against yawns and wandering thoughts and the persistent urge to check the time. Herein lies the fundamental asymmetry of witnessing. The watched cannot look away, while the watchers must constantly resist the temptation to do so. Our journey through the history of execution sleepers has revealed an uncomfortable truth. Humans will do almost anything to avoid uncomfortable realities, including napping through another's demise. But the deeper lesson lies in recognizing why we must occasionally deny ourselves this luxury. Staying awake for life's harsher spectacles, whether literal executions or metaphorical ones, serves purposes beyond morbid curiosity or performative virtue. It is how we maintain our tether to reality, how we honor the gravity of existence, how we remember that the line between watcher and watched is thinner than we'd like to believe. Consider the practical benefits first. The spectator who remains alert notices details that escape the dozers, the subtle tremor in the hangman's hands that suggests even professionals feel nerves, the way light reflects differently off sweat-slicked skin than tear-dampened cheeks, the precise moment when a condemned man's eyes shift from fear to acceptance. Well, these observations form a repository of human understanding that sleeping through history cannot provide. The difference between a society that watches carefully and one that naps through its pivotal moments, is the difference between diagnosis and symptom, between prevention and repeating the same bloody mistakes. Then there's the matter of justice, or at least its approximation. When everyone watches attentively, abuses become harder to disguise. The executioner who botches his job faces scrutiny. The corrupt judge hears muttered disapproval. The overly enthusiastic spectators reveal their bloodlust for what it is. But when half the crowd snores through proceedings, standards slip quietly. Cruelty flourishes in the gaps between yawns, and the machinery of death grows sloppy without attentive witnesses. Modern equivalents abound. The council meeting where important votes happen while citizens scroll through phones, the protest that fizzles when allies grow bored, the slow creep of authoritarianism that succeeds because maintaining vigilance proves exhausting. The moral dimension cuts deeper still. To witness suffering attentively is to acknowledge its reality, however briefly. The sleeping spectator treats the world as background noise to their personal drama, while the wakeful one, even if powerless to intervene, at least grants the sufferer the dignity of being seen. This explains why prisoners so often remarked on sleeping spectators with disproportionate anger. It wasn't the inattention itself that stung, but the implicit message that their deaths weren't worth staying awake for. Our modern world offers endless opportunities to replicate this offense without leaving our homes, to treat others' pain as inconvenient interruptions to our streaming schedules. The psychological cost of perpetual avoidance compounds over time. Just as the execution regulars who consistently dozed through hangings found themselves increasingly numb to violence, so too do we risk desensitizing ourselves through selective attention. The mind that habitually looks away from discomfort becomes incapable of recognizing real threats amid the noise. Historical records show that chronic execution sleepers often missed more than just the main event. They failed to notice rising tensions in the crowd, didn't spot the pickpockets working their section, remained oblivious to the political undercurrents that made each hanging a potential spark for unrest. Contemporary parallels suggest our own inattention carries similar blind spots. Yet the strongest argument for staying awake may be the most selfish. Those who pay attention tend to fare better when fortunes reverse. The aristocrats who napped through revolutionary rhetoric woke to find their carriages burning. The businessmen who ignored labor unrest faced strikes that shuttered factories. Even the executioners themselves discovered that public interest in their craft waned fastest among audiences they'd failed to properly engage. Today's equivalent might be the tech mogul who disregards privacy concerns until regulators come knocking, or the media company that ignores shifting viewer habits until their platform collapses overnight. The sleepers of history rarely see the axe coming until it's too late to dodge. This isn't to suggest one must gawk at every misfortune like some rubbernecking motorist. The art lies in discernment, knowing which moments demand full attention and which merit only polite disinterest. Our execution-watching ancestors developed various strategies for this balance. Reading the crowd's mood to gauge an event's significance, watching officials rather than just the condemned for signs of corruption, maintaining enough detachment to think critically without disengaging entirely. Their best practices, stripped of the gallows context, remain surprisingly applicable to modern media consumption and civic participation. The execution analogy ultimately fails at one crucial point. Most of today's important spectacles lack the clear beginning, middle, and end of a hang. Our crises unfold gradually, their trapdoors hidden in bureaucratic jargon and incremental changes. Staying awake now means maintaining attention without the benefit of drum rolls or dramatic final speeches, without the certainty that if we just watch this one event to its conclusion, we can go home satisfied. The test has become marathon rather than sprint, and the temptation to mentally check out grows accordingly. Perhaps this explains why we've grown so nostalgic for eras when moral choices seemed clearer, when good and evil appeared to stand neatly separated like executioner and condemned. Our ancestors could attend a hanging, feel they'd witnessed justice served, then resume their lives with clean consciences. We lack such convenient punctuation marks in our moral narratives, which may be why we've created digital approximations in cancel culture and viral outrage. They provide the illusion of finality that real-world problems stubbornly refuse to offer. But the execution sleepers would remind us that even their simple binary world was more complicated than it seemed. Many who seemed monstrous on the scaffold were later revealed as victims of circumstance or injustice. Others who died to thunderous applause are now remembered as martyrs. The spectators who stayed alert had at least a chance of noticing these nuances, while the sleepers only ever absorbed the official narrative. Our modern information landscape magnifies this dynamic exponentially. The wakeful stand at least a chance of spotting contradictions and complexities, while the mentally absent simply swallow whatever version of events requires the least energy to digest. So here we arrive at our concluding paradox. Staying awake for life's uncomfortable truths often proves exhausting, but sleeping through them eventually proves catastrophic. The execution spectators who mastered this balance, who knew when to lean forward and when to conserve their attention, left behind records suggesting they slept better at night, if less in public. They witnessed enough to understand their world without being broken by it, spoke up when it mattered without exhausting themselves on every outrage, and maintained the alertness needed to protect themselves when the machinery of power lurched in their direction. The condemned man's eyes stay open because he has no choice. We keep ours open by choice or not at all. Between these two states, the enforced vigilance of the doomed and the comfortable drowsiness of the oblivious, lies the narrow path of the conscious witness. It's a harder road than sleeping through history, but it's the only one that leads somewhere worth waking up for. So the next time you feel yourself drifting off during life's darker performances, whether from despair or distraction or simple self-preservation, remember the execution sleepers of old. And they dreamed through revolutions and reforms, through injustices both perpetuated and overcome, only to wake and wonder how the world had changed without them. Then ask yourself, when future historians recount our era's pivotal moments, do you want to feature as one who watched carefully, or one who snored softly through the transformation? The choice, at least for now, remains yours to make. Just don't take too long to decide. History's trapdoor waits for no one.